Thank you, Senators. The hour of convening has arrived, and the Senate will now come to order. At this time, I'd like to ask that all unauthorized persons exit the chamber. The Chair would like to recognize the distinguished honorable senator from the 53rd District.
Mr. President, it's a glorious day at our state capitol, and under your leadership, the few men and women here right now are ready for battle for the people of Georgia. There's not much exciting stuff to say, except today is National Blueberry Popover Day, a favorite of the senator from the 50, what number is you? Fourth. Mr. President, the journal's been read and found to be correct.
Is there objection to dispensing with the reading of the journal? The chair hears none, and the reading of the journal is dispensed with. Is there objection to the confirmation of the journal? The chair hears none, and the journal is confirmed. All senators who have bills and resolutions, please bring them to the Secretary's desk. Mr. Secretary, first reading of Senate bills and resolutions, please.
Senate Bill 499 by Senator Williams of the 39th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Chapter 2 of Title 21 of the OCGA relating to primaries elections generally, so as to provide for same-day registration and voting, provide for procedures and notices, to provide related matters.
Ethics.
Senate Bill 500 by Senator Harbison of the 15th. A bill to be titled an act to amend Article 9 of Chapter 7 of Title 31 of the OCGA relating to hospice care, so as to provide that hospice administrators are not required.
Health and Human Services.
Senate Bill 501 by Senator Sims of the 12th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend an act to create a Board of Elections and Registration for Randolph County and to provide for its powers and duties.
State and local government.
Senate Resolution 931 by Senator Black of the 8th and others. A resolution urging Congress to expand the eligibility requirements of the H-2A and H-2B guest worker visa programs and for other purposes. That completes the order, Mr. President.
First reading in reference of House bills and resolutions, please.
House Bill 378 by Representative Williamson of the 115th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Title 48 of the OCGA relating to revenue and taxation, so as to require the collection and remittance of excise taxes on rental.
Finance.
House Bill 877 by Representative Hogan of the 179th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Title 40 of the OCGA relating to motor vehicles and traffic, so as to provide for standards
Public safety.
House Bill 894 by Representative Meeks of the 178th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Code Section 243 of the OCGA relating to Seed Development Commission composition.
Agriculture and Consumer Affairs.
House Bill 903 by Representative Dollar of the 45th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Title 40 of the OCGA relating to motor vehicles and traffic, so as to provide for the issuance of a traffic citation to a vehicle owner in lieu of the individual.
Special Judiciary.
House Bill 911 by Representative Setzler of the 35th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Chapter 6 of Title 16, Article 2 of Chapter 3 of Title 35, Article 3 of Chapter 5 of Title 42, and Article 1 of Chapter 2 of Title 49 of the OCGA relating to sexual offenses, the Georgia Crime Information Center, conditions of detention
Judiciary.
generally. House Bill 983 by Representative Williams of the 145th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Article 2 of Chapter 1 of Title 42 of the OCGA relating to Sexual Offender Registration Review Board, so as to revise the information required to be provided by sexual
Judiciary.
offenders. House Bill 984 by Representative Burchett of the 176th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Article 1 of Chapter 10 of Title 17 of the OCGA relating to the procedure for sentencing and imposition of punishment, so as to change provisions relating to sentencing.
Judiciary.
House Bill 1008 by Representative Campbell of the 171st and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Code Section 82111 of the OCGA relating to definitions relative to factory-built buildings and dwelling units.
Economic Development.
House Bill 1071 by Representative Gullett of the 19th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Code Section 46527 relating to telephone solicitations to residential, mobile, or wireless subscribers, Public Service Commission to
Regulated
establish.
Industries.
House Resolution 1094 by Representative Donahue of the 30th and others. A resolution authorizing the granting of non-exclusive easements for the construction, installation, operation, and maintenance of facilities, utilities, ingresses.
Government oversight.
That completes the order, Mr. President.
Secretary will now read reports of standing committees, please. Secretary will now read bills and resolutions for the second time.
Senate Bill 288 by Senator Anderson of the 43rd and others. Criminal history record information, automatic restriction, final disposition other than a conviction, provide. Senate Bill 299 by Senator Martin of the 9th. Insurance, disability income insurance, residents of the state, monthly confirmation premiums, annual disclosure of premiums received, provide. Senate Bill 375 by Senator Mullis of the 53rd and others. Cigarettes and tobacco-related products, additional penalties regarding any person under 21 years of age, provide. Definition of vapor product, revise. Senate Bill 379 by Senator Stone, the 23rd and others. Barbers and cosmetologists, psychologists, certain provisions change. Senate Bill 400 by Senator Parent of the 42nd and others. Move on when ready act dual credit courses, Office of Student Achievement to establish objectives and participation targets for the program require. Senate Bill 411 by Senator Kennedy of the 18th and others. Electric membership corporations comply with certain requirements in determining the rates for attachments to utility poles by communication service providers require. Senate Bill 412 by Senator Roberts of the 29th and others. Property insurance, meaning, revise, parameters under which certain contracts, agreements, or instruments may be canceled, change. Senate Bill 416 by Senator Mullis of the 53rd and others. Office of College and Career Transitions, change the name to Office of College and Career Academics. Senate Bill 418 by Senator Thompson of the 14th and others. Georgia State Indemnification Fund, when indemnification shall be paid in instances of a heart attack, public safety officer resulting in certain disabilities or death, revise. Senate Bill 423 by Senator Albers of the 56th and others. Max Groover Act, expanded definition of hazing, provide, enact. Senate Bill 426 by Senator Strickland of the 17th and others. Air quality, reporting of any unpermitted release of ethylene oxide to the Environmental Protection Division of the Department of Natural Resources, provide. Senate Bill 428 by Senator Cowsert of the 46th and others. Fair Business Practices Act of 1975, deceptive practice of musical performance without recording group's permission, prohibit. Senate Bill 432 by Senator Harbin of the 16th and others. Life insurance, annual notification of policy owners and requested beneficiaries of the existence of such policies, require. Senate Bill 441 by Senator Mullis of the 53rd and others. State income tax, all expenditures of a production company's state-certified productions may be combined to meet spending thresholds, provide. Senate Bill 446 by Senator Walker of the 20th and others. Cash bonds, unclaimed cash bonds, provide. Senate Bill 451 by Senator Kennedy of the 18th and others. Deficiencies connected with improvements to realty and resulting injuries, actions that may be brought pursuant to Code Section 9351, clarify. Senate Bill 460 by Senator Miller of the 49th and others. Counties and municipal corporations, regulatory powers of cities and counties with certificates of public necessity and convenience or medallion programs, provide. Senate Bill 464 by Senator Kennedy of the 18th and others. Georgia Uniform Mediation Act, uniform laws governing mediation and participants in mediation, provide and act. Senate Bill 476 by Senator Kirkpatrick of the 32nd and others. Animal protection, pet dealers to microchip dogs and cats, provide. Senate Bill 477 by Senator Kirkpatrick of the 32nd and others. Investigation of family violence, terminology used in determining whom to arrest, revise. Senate Bill 479 by Senator Martin of the 9th, rules of the road, use of standalone electronic device, persons under 18 years of age while operating a motor vehicle, prohibit. Senate Bill 480 by Senator Huffstetler of the 52nd, state administrative organization, compensation to be set from sales and use tax collections on contingency basis, authorize. Senate Bill 484 by Senator Kirkpatrick of the 32nd and others, health, solemn covenant of the states to award prizes for curing diseases, adopt. Senate Bill 489 by Senator Gooch of the 51st and others. Lighting equipment of motor vehicles requiring an amber strobe light upon low-speed vehicles, provisions, repeal. Senate Resolution 693 by Senator Sims of the 12th and others. Ways and Means Conference Room, Representative Alfred Jackson J. Powell Jr., dedicate. Senate Resolution 818 by Senator Dolezal of the 27th and others. Right to register and vote. Only citizens of the United States shall have a right to vote in elections, clarify, CA. Senate Resolution 844 by Senator Miller of the 49th and others. Deputy Nicholas Blaine Dixon Memorial Bridge, Hall County, dedicate. Senate Resolution 854 by Senator Cowsert of the 46th and others. Article 5 of the United States Constitution, a convention of the states, apply. Senate Resolution 885 by Senator Harper of the 7th and others. General obligation debt, make loans or grants, counties, municipalities, consolidated governments, and local authorities, airports, authorize the state, CA. House Bill 511 by Representative Tanner of the 9th and others. Highways, bridges, and ferries, funding sources and consolidated state entity for the planning and implementation of mobility and transit services, provisions. House Bill 752 by Representative Belton of the 112th and others. Professions and businesses, national background checks by FBI through Georgia Crime Information Center for licensing to practice as a physical therapist or physical therapist assistant, provide. That completes order, Mr. President.
It's now time for our morning roll call. Are there any motions to excuse? Any motions to excuse? In 3, 2, 1. All right. Secretary will call the roll of senators. Signify your presence by voting the yea switch. The secretary will unlock the machine. All right, it's now time for our morning devotional. It is now time for our morning devotional. I'd like to ask that all senators please take your seats and cease all audible conversations. Doorkeepers, please secure the doors. I'm glad to know that the senator from the 53rd is hanging out with Good Chaplain's former colleague over in the House today, certainly keeping good company. But it's my honor to recognize the Rules Chairman to lead us in our pledge and to introduce our very special chaplain of the day.
Thank you, Mr. President. If you would, join me in honoring our country. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And let's honor our state. I pledge allegiance to the Georgia flag and the principles for which it stands, wisdom, justice, and moderation. Yes, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, another friend of mine from the House. Today's chaplain of the day is Jay Neal. Many of you know him, and some of you may have served with him. He's been the pastor of 4 different churches in 35 years. They keep kicking him out, apparently. He is currently the Lakeview Wesley Church in Rossville, another part of my district. Jay also served as campus director for Penville Addictions Ministries in Lafayette at their campus for 3 years. He served in the House of Representatives here from 2005 to 2013 and was the former director of the Governor's Office of Transitions, Support, and Reentry for Governor Deal for 2 years. Jay Neal is currently serving as a Criminal Justice Coordinator Council since 2015. Jay's married to his wife Gretchen for 36 years, has 2 wonderful daughters, Jessica and Brittany, and their husbands, and a couple of, and 7 grandchildren. Jay's a wonderful friend. He's a great community leader and takes people who need to find the Lord and helps them find him. Please give your attention to Jay Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Lieutenant Governor, for the invitation to speak today. It's an honor to be with you and to share a few thoughts with you. I understand that you all sacrifice greatly in order to provide the service that you do to your communities. A lot of people believe that people run for public office, whether it's on a local level or a state level, such as state senate, more about what it does for them. And after serving a few years and serving with many of you, I understand that's not the case. Most of you are here to be public servants, and you are committed to doing the best that you can as a public servant. I also know that you work long hours and that your families and your careers suffer. They sacrifice along with the hours that you put in. Today I know is going to be a long day. It's that busy time of year. Legislatively speaking, this is crossover eve, right? As a matter of fact, at some point today, some of you are hoping to get before the Rules Committee to get that bill on for the last day before the deadline passes. I assume that you're probably like me. This is the time of year that kind of the drilling gets to going a little bit. The calendar is short. The days are long. You have a lot of obstacles in your path. You feel like you're carrying a heavy burden, and the adrenaline's flowing as you're trying to get to that finish line before the end of crossover. And I understand that. I've been there. As a matter of fact, I've got a very competitive nature. I am a competitor at heart. You probably have a competitive nature as well. It's about time to head into one of the most competitive times at all. Primary season's just around the corner. Just getting involved in a political race is a very, very competitive thing. I'm competitive in just about everything that I do. Last year, my wife bought me an Apple Watch. I don't know how many of you have Apple Watches. I learned within a few days after having this Apple Watch that it tracks all your activities. and that there are 3 rings that have to be closed, or they're supposed to be closed if you're getting the proper amount of exercise. It took me a few days to understand that, and when I learned that it was tracking me to that point, I couldn't stand the thoughts of not closing those rings. And the worst thing about it is it doesn't just track you on a daily basis, it tracks you, I guess, forever. You can go back and you can look at how you've done historically on closing those rings. And I can tell you, once I figured out that my watch was tracking me, it changed the way I exercise. It changed my daily approach. And for about a year now, I've closed all 3 rings every day with a couple of exceptions. I injured my foot in September, and I had to take about a week off from exercising. And one day, and I can tell you the day, it was December the 9th. December the 9th, I didn't close one of my rings. I liked just a hair closing it. I didn't know it until a few weeks later when I went back to look at the history and just look at how well I was doing. And all of a sudden, I noticed December 9th, I lacked just a hair closing a ring. I can tell you that's not going to happen again. I'm not going to let that. I'm a competitive man. I have a competitive nature, a competitive spirit. You probably do as well. And this time of year, those juices begin to flow. Trying to get those bills to the floor. I'm reminded of a bill that I had, it's probably been a dozen years ago. A bill that some of you may remember this bill as I begin to tell you a little bit about it. We were in a time in the legislature where we were cutting budgets drastically. And we had slowed the roll of the legislative calendar. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that, what that's like. But we had done that. As a matter of fact, we had slowed it so much that my local superintendent, school superintendent, came to me and she said, Representative, we're about to that place. We're about to that deadline to where we're going to have to extend contracts. And we don't know what kind of funding we're going to have from the state. And we're concerned that we're not going to have enough funding for all the positions that we need to be extending contracts for. We're going to have to send some pink slips out. In a small community like Catoosa County, pink slips to teachers is not going to go over very well. She said, do you think it would be possible that we could extend by 30 days the deadline for extending contracts? I said, I certainly see what we can do. I reached out to Governor Perdue and got Governor Perdue on board, and they got the speaker on board, and the plan was we're going to roll this out. We're going to roll it out quickly through the House, get it to the Senate, pass it quickly, immediately transmit. The governor's going to sign it. School systems are going to know they don't have to send out pink slips. They're going to have that extra 30 days. And everything was working perfectly until it got to the Senate. And when it got to the Senate, one of the associations decided that they were going to oppose it. One was okay, the other one decided they were going to oppose it. And when they decided to oppose it, the Democratic caucus decided to go with them, and they were going to lock down on this bill. So I'm in Education Committee, and I'm thinking I'm still okay because it's going to pass with the party line vote, right? And we'll get to the floor, we'll pass with a party line vote, and I'll still get it done. And in Education Committee, one of the Republican senators opposed the bill. My margin's getting real narrow now. I can still get it passed with one. We went through the hearing and we're getting ready to take votes, and so the chairman calls for the vote, and a freshman Republican senator started to raise his hand for yay, and the one Republican senator that was opposing it elbowed him, and he dropped his hand. And the two of them voted no, and that was the deciding vote in me losing my bill in House Education Committee. Now, I don't know if any of y'all have ever had that happen. You probably never had anything like that happen to you. But I did. And my first thought was, and this was an important bill, but my first thought wasn't about the bill or the impact. My first thought was, I can't believe I just lost that. And I'm going to have to go back and tell my superintendent that I managed to pull victory out of the jaws of defeat, or defeat out of the jaws of victory, and lost my bill in committee. And I stood outside the door waiting for that committee to be dismissed. And I'm not one, I don't cuss, I don't yell, I don't scream, and I didn't that day. But I waited outside the doors for that Republican freshman senator. And when he came out, I greeted him with, "What are you doing?" And we had a pretty intense conversation about how he had just derailed a bill that was important publicly, in front of colleagues, in front of lobbyists, in front of the general public. And it was only after I began walking back to my office that I really thought about what I had just done and how I had just been the person that I promised myself I'd never be. I reached out to his office to see if he was in the office, if I could come see him, and he wasn't in the office. He was in a transportation committee meeting in the Senate mezzanine. So I walked over and stood outside the mezzanine and waited on him. And when that meeting was over, he came out and I apologized for my behavior, and I asked him to forgive me. And we had a good conversation and shed a few tears together that day on the steps of the mezzanine. And that conversation was the beginning of a friendship, mutual respect. The next day he would actually come to me and say, committee rules allows for someone who voted no on a bill that failed to ask for reconsideration. He ended up asking for reconsideration. We got the bill passed. But I learned a valuable lesson that day, and a lesson I want to leave with you. Relationships are critical. And sometimes in our competitive spirit and our competitive nature, we want to win, and we don't really consider the costs of winning. And sometimes what we do in an attempt to win, sometimes what we do in our efforts damages relationships. It may damage relationships across the aisle. It may damage relationships across the hall. It may damage relationships on the second floor. It may damage relationships with supporters back home, or maybe even those back home who didn't support you, but you've worked hard and you've earned their support through the years. Sometimes it damages relationships within caucuses, among friends, and among families. While serving in the House, my seatmates in the chamber were Representative Mary Margaret Oliver and Representative Kathy Ash. I don't have to tell you that we didn't always agree. But I learned to respect them. I developed a relationship with them. We had a mutual relationship, I believe. We didn't let the issues or our disagreements define our relationships. And I think that's absolutely critical for those of us who are in public service. We just quoted the pledge. We just said the pledge to the Georgia flag and to the principles for which it stands: wisdom, justice, and moderation. Sometimes our competitive spirit and our desire to win, our drive to win, sometimes the pressures that are placed upon us in the ultra-political environment that we now live in makes it hard for us to follow those principles. And we can go back a little further. Back to Malachi chapter 6, verse 8. Micah chapter 6, verse 8, I'm sorry. He has shown you what is good and what the Lord requires of you: to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Or in the Message translation, which I like a little better, but he's already made it plain how to live, what to do, what God is looking for in men and women. It's quite simple. Do what is fair and just to your neighbor. Be compassionate and loyal in your love. And don't take yourself too seriously. Take God seriously. And that, my friends, is the challenge I want to leave you with. Strive to be that person. Will you pray with me? Our Father, we thank you so much for the privilege we have to call upon your name. We thank you, Lord, for these men and women, the servants of the people. working hard for the people, for the great state of Georgia. We thank you, Lord, for their sacrifice. We thank you for their commitment. We thank you, Lord, for that competitive drive within them, because we know that it's that competitive drive that enables them to accomplish great things. But God, I pray that you would help them to temper it with wisdom and justice and moderation. You would help them to temper that drive with a commitment to do what is fair and just to their neighbor. That they would be compassionate and loyal in love, and that they would not take themselves too seriously, but to take you seriously. And Lord, we'll praise you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
All right, if I could get everyone's attention, we're going to introduce our doctor of the day today, and I just want to, I've got some personal information because a good friend of ours, Regina Quick, is good friends with Dr. Casey Henritz, and Iora Health partners with Humana to provide Georgians with innovative, integrated primary care, and obviously that's an important area of focus for me, so we're excited to have the doctor of the day with us here today, and I'd like to call on the senator from the 42nd to introduce our doctor of the day.
Thank you, Mr. President. In addition to everything that our president mentioned, I do want to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Casey Henritz. She is board certified in family medicine. She received her degree from West Virginia School of Osteopathic Medicine. She works at Iora Primary Care, which embraces a team-based, holistic approach to treating patients. Before that, she was a primary care physician at Emory Healthcare. She's a member of the American Academy of Family Physicians, the American Medical Association, and the Georgia Academy of Family Physicians. She resides in the Edgewood neighborhood of Atlanta. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Dr. Casey Henritz.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Parent. The other thing that they did not mention is that public speaking is my least favorite thing in the history of the world. But I appreciate you guys having me, and thank you for all the service that you are providing, especially during this very stressful time. COVID-19 has taken over the news and taken over our lives a little bit, but the leadership from this Capitol is really going to help all of Georgia get through this crisis. Please wash your hands for at least 20 seconds. Please sing happy birthday at least twice while washing your hands, and that is what I will leave you with.
Thank you. Are there any unanimous consents? Chair sees none. Now going to move on to points of personal privilege. The chair recognizes the senator from the 9th for a point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today because we have a good friend of mine, longtime family friend who's on the floor, Mr. Tony Powell. He's my guest today. On the last day of 2019, Gwinnett County lost one of its most distinguished citizens, and that was Tony Powell's wife, Emily Powell. I want to say three things very quickly. Well, first thing I want to say is anybody that went to that funeral was deeply moved by that funeral in such a positive way. I've never been to a true celebration of life in which someone's life and someone's impact on the community was celebrated in such a way that you left in a better mood. And it was a life-changing moment, and I will never forget that day as long as I live. But three things I want to say about Emily Powell. First things first, she was a pioneer. Emily was a part of the first class at Davidson College to include female students. I believe they called them the Wild Women of Davidson College, I believe was their name. She was also a part of the first class of magistrate court judges in Gwinnett County when they created that court, and she served Gwinnett County honorably in that for 20 years, more than 20 years. Second thing, she loved her family more than anything. She was inseparable from her husband, Tony. She was by his side all the time. She loved him dearly, and he loved her back, and you can tell when he speaks of her to this day. Secondly, she was a fierce advocate for her children, her son Nathan and her daughter Jessie. The final thing about Emily is she was an incredible encourager. She spent innumerable hours mentoring new judges in Gwinnett County. We would not have the bench that we have in Gwinnett County today without the impact and without Emily Powell's guidance with those new judges. But she also had a special way of giving people the advice when they need it and in the appropriate way. And I can share a personal story. After serving 6 years, or when I was in my 6th year of the city council in Lawrenceville, I confided in my good friend, Tony Powell, that I was not going to seek re-election. He supported me fully in that moment and then quickly went to his wife, Emily, and ratted me out. So we had a little dinner. I didn't know it was what was going on here. We actually had a dinner planned. So at the appropriate time during the dinner, we were all sitting down. Dinner was about over. Dessert had just been finished. Emily pulls up a chair next to me and carefully, quietly, but I might add very sternly, pointed out all the reasons that I should seek re-election and the reasons I should continue in public service. And she was very effective in doing so. At that time, I did tell them, but by the end of the night, I was convinced that I should seek a fourth term in the Lawrenceville City Council. And quite frankly, if I hadn't have done that, I wouldn't be here today. Emily Powell was an amazing light in Gwinnett County. She served us so well. She is sorely missed. And I just wanted to take today to honor her appropriately and encourage my dear brother, Tony Powell, because we know it's hard. We know each and every day is hard, and it may get a little easier, but it never gets easy. So I want to honor you today. And if Mr. President, if you don't mind, I would like to rise now in a moment of silence in memory of our dear friend and sweet soul, Emily Powell.
Senators ask that we rise to our feet and offer a moment of silence.
Let's pray. Amen. Mr. President, I yield the well.
Thank you, Senator. Chair recognizes the senator from the 34th for a point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. I rise because this is a special day, women's suffrage. We have suffered, we have come to join you in this body. We have birthed your children. We have done a lot of things, but I am so proud that the Women Legislative Caucus hold an annual breakfast so that we shall never forget where we have come from. This morning was no exception. I had the honor and the privilege to recognize my servant leader from my district, the Fayette County side of my district. I try to alternate between Fayette and Clayton. And this year, my honoree, Pearline Green, is in the gallery. Stand up, Mrs. Green. And with her is her husband, Greg Green, who, with them being retired, they had the time to stay around and wait for me to make sure I recognized her for all that she is doing for women in my district. We stick together, we work together, we make sure that the young people coming behind us are aware of where we've been and where we are attempting to go. Thank you again, Mr. and Mrs. Green, for being here this morning. And if you all would, just stand with me and let's give them a round of applause. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the will.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 39th for a point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, this morning I rise to congratulate Sonia Halpern on receiving the Women's Caucus Yellow Rose Servant Leadership Award. Sonia Halpern has a fierce passion for the arts, education, women in politics, and her passion has manifested itself in her involvement on boards for Public Broadcasting Atlanta, the Children's School, South Arts, the DeVos Institute of Arts Management at the University of Maryland, and the YMCA of Metro Atlanta, as well as leadership roles for the National Black Arts Festival. Appointed by the President of the United States, Sonia became the first African American and first Georgian to serve as chair of the President's Advisory Committee on the Arts. Sonia is civic-minded and engaged in her community. She's a member of the Women's Leadership Forum, a founding member of Electing Women Alliance Atlanta, a founding member of the Atlanta School for the Arts, and a member of the Atlanta chapter of Jack and Jill of America. Colleagues, it is only fitting and proper that this exemplary servant leader be recognized by this body for her contributions to the arts and education in the city of Atlanta, the state of Georgia, and the United States of America. Please join me in congratulating Ms. Sonia Halpern, who is with us in the gallery today, joined by her husband, Daniel Halpern, and her parents, Elsie and James McLaughlin. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 3rd.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have some very special guests with us today, the Georgia Teenage Republicans. I believe many of them are here in the gallery. If you're here, there they are, if you just stand up. And we just want to commend them for their good work. And this organization was founded in 1978 to provide opportunities and an environment to allow them youth to engage in education and the political process, and to be exposed to America's founding principles of democracy and civics. And many of them have gone on to become leaders in their schools and in our communities, and we're just so grateful for their contribution to the government of this state and just for all of their good work. And let's just give them a big hand. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the well.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 40th for a point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. Mother Teresa once said, "I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the waters to create many ripples." It was an honor this morning to be with so many women who have cast those stones and created those ripples that have truly made a difference in the lives of our fellow Georgians. I was among members of the Women's Legislative Caucus this morning who had the honor of presenting a Servant Leadership Award to a woman in my community, Deacon Leslie Ann Drake, who started a program called Path to Shine, which recruits volunteers to mentor children in our schools. There are 150 volunteers who serve 200 children. We talk a lot this session about the dangers of gangs and gang recruitment. This is a program that is working at the core with young children to keep children focused on a positive path. Also, I'd like to recognize Leslie Ann, Deacon Leslie Ann, who is in the balcony. If you could stand, and let's give her some applause. I would also like to recognize 3 women in this chamber who have been here a long time, who have contributed so much to the Women's Legislative Caucus. And if you see behind these gentlemen over here, there are 3 rather large vases of beautiful yellow flowers. When the men move, you'll be able to see them, I promise. And those flowers are going to 3 women in the chamber. The first is Senator Renee Unterman, who is serving as a tri-chair of the Women's Legislative Caucus, and whom I had the honor to serve with when we were in the House of Representatives. If you could give Senator Unterman a hand. The second is Senator Gloria Butler, who is one of the former co-chairs of the Women's Caucus, and Senator Butler and I were actually freshman legislators together in the House in 1999. Let's give Senator Butler a hand. And a third woman who was one of the founders of the Women's Legislative Caucus, who has just fortunately come back into the chamber to see her beautiful flowers on the windowsill, is Senator Nan Orrock. Let's give Nan a hand. Thank you very much. It was truly an honor to be with so many women this morning, making such a difference in the state of Georgia, and give them one moment of glory for their tireless work that they do for the state of Georgia. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the well.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 5th for a point of personal privilege. Chair recognizes the senator from the 5th for a point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, friends, I was in a private gathering with a family, friends, a few weeks ago. I met a young woman, 9 years old, and she was just fascinated to hear about me that I'm a Georgia State Senator. So she came and talked to me, said, you know what, I like to get involved in local politics and see what's going on. Maybe someday I want to be mayor. I said, oh, that's great. I said, after talking to her a few minutes, I said, you know what, I maybe want to be a state senator. So a couple of weeks ago, I got a text message from her dad. We want to come and visit the Capitol. So I want you to welcome her, Akoya. She's somewhere in the Senate gallery, I heard. There she is. So give her a welcome. Maybe she might come and serve one day at the Senate chamber over here. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the word.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 42nd for a point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. President. This morning, I had the honor of recognizing the work of Beth Haynes at the Women's Legislative Caucus Servant Leaders Award celebration. Beth is a local DeKalb County mom whose child has dyslexia. She got very involved last year in a leadership position with decoding dyslexia and pushing for the passage of our first legislation. Spearheaded through the Senate to test kids that have for dyslexia in early elementary grades. She also took it upon herself to ensure that every teacher in her local elementary school was trained in teaching via a structured literacy method, which is not only appropriate for dyslexic kids and those others that struggle to learn to read, but actually works for all methods, for all children. And only because she took this leadership role and having the teachers in her school be trained can the kids in that school receive the benefit. So she's done great work throughout DeKalb County, and she's now doing great work trying to bring the same benefits to all students throughout our state. Thank you, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 35th for a point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senators, I had the honor and privilege today also to participate in celebrating awesome anointed women from my district. And we also passed a resolution for two of them. One is the very famous Dottie Peoples. And we said, whereas Dottie Peoples has long been recognized for her award-winning career as a gospel singer, recording industry executive, radio host, and entrepreneur. And at a young age, she had a distinctive voice that garnered attention wherever she performed. She even performed as a small child with the legendary Dorothy Norwood, and her career has taken to the next level as she signed with Air Records and earned her first Stella Award in 1994 with her release of On Time God, which rocketed to #1 on the charts. And then in 2008, she formed her own record label. And she loves her God, her music, and prayer, and it has defined her and her career, and it led her to work in the recording industry with Christian studios, such as Church Door Records, and etc., where she was the general manager for 14 years and launched her own radio show. She is awesome, anointed, appointed, accepted, approved. She's a Grammy nominee, a Dove Award winner, and a multi-stellar award winner. And she's long been cherished for her love of people and her passion for sharing the gospel. And she's right here and she's holding up her award that she got this morning, Dottie Peoples. Yes, let's give her a hand. And she's gonna, she has a CD for anyone who wants one. You have to go ask her, but she wants to give our Lieutenant Governor a autographed CD at this time. Let her give it to him. And also, we had the special guest from Douglas County, the Solicitor General of Douglas County, Sonia Compton. And she is our first African-American female to win this position. She's been a dedicated and brilliant lawyer for many, many years in Douglasville, Georgia, and she received her Juris Doctorate from John Marshall Law School. We passed a resolution for her as well today. She's a distinguished woman, and that is Sonia Compton, and she is here with her husband today, and she received her award that she's holding up right now as well. So we thank them very much, and the African women that today is our special guests up in the gallery are the Ahmadiyya Muslim Women Auxiliary. Please stand, women, and as well as the African Women in Leadership Organization, Dr. Isi Ademudia and others. Please stand. Please give them a warm Senate welcome. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the will.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 48th for a point of personal privilege. She waves. Chair recognizes the senator from the 25th for a point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to stand here today and recognize Mr. Stephen Hauser, Director of Twin Lakes Library System in Baldwin County, and he was selected as 2019 Librarian of the Year. So we're going to go present him with a special presentation, resolution, I should say, on the North Wing steps here in a few minutes, and I just want to recognize him as my point of personal privilege to this esteemed body. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
All right, you've got a consent calendar of privilege resolutions before you. Does any senator wish to remove a resolution from the consent calendar? Is there objection to adoption of the resolutions on the consent calendar? The chair hears none. The resolutions on the consent calendar are adopted. Are there any motions to withdraw and commit? The chair sees none. What purpose does the senator from the 44th rise? It was not on. It just turned on after we started with the consent calendar.
No, because it went off. You turned it off. I had my light on.
I'll recognize the senator from the 44th for a point of personal privilege.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Colleagues, I just rise briefly this morning, first to recognize a couple of women, and one was recognized in the House this morning, and she's standing to the right over here, Ms. Shirley Nichols, and she was recognized by Representative Kim Schofield. We attended first grade through, stand right there. We attended first grade through 12th grade together at Fountain School, the segregated schools of Clayton County, many years ago, and we congratulate you. She's an activist in her community here in Atlanta. Let's give her a big hand. Also, I'm not sure if Ms. Matt Hartsfield is in the audience today. She might be in the gallery, but she's a community activist. I've known her all my life. She was recognized as a servant leader. Mrs. Matt Hartsfield. And then I had the great pleasure this morning of recognizing Dr. Gloria Duncan. Dr. Duncan has served in numerous positions as an English teacher, department chair, and instructional lead teacher for the Clayton County Public Schools for 12 years, middle school assistant principal, middle school and high school principal, adjunct graduate education instructor for teacher education for Mercer University, adjunct graduate education instructor in the educational leadership for Georgia State, for the State University of West Georgia, and serves currently as the Director of Professional Learning, and one time the interim superintendent of Clayton County Public Schools. She has been the recipient of many awards, including Teacher of the Year, the NAACP Image Award in Education, and Who's Who among American female executives. The important thing about Dr. Duncan and all these things that she has done is that she's a former president of the Honor Fountain Professional Club, an organization of retired teachers who African-American teachers who taught during the segregated times in Clayton County of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. It is my pleasure this morning to present Dr. Gloria Duncan, and she is here with her daughter, Joy. Please stand, give her a big hand. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the well.
Chair recognizes the pro tem for a point of personal privilege that he just remembered.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great honor to be before this august body this morning. I've got a gentleman with me that has absolutely had a huge impact on particularly Georgia in general, but particularly on urban radio listeners. Mr. Frank Ski. Frank, raise your hand over here in the corner. Raise your hand, Frank. He's the rainmaker of urban radio. Frank has been on the radio for 30 years. He's a disc jockey. He's a recording artist. He's a radio, a film, and TV personality. He's got the Gospel Stellar Award, the Players Club contribution to the Corner and the Wire, the Journalist of the Year. But more importantly than all his accolades is he is an active philanthropist. He works to provide financial assistance to low-income youths and serving their needs in terms of athletics, in terms of education, in terms of cultural advancement. He's a man of the year, and he's our great friend and a great influence on many, many Georgians. Ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't met Frank Ski, take a moment to get to know him. You'll be glad you did. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Mr. Secretary, will you read a resolution?
Senate Resolution number 935 by Senator Dugan of the 30th and others. A resolution relative to meetings and adjournments of the General Assembly and for other purposes. That completes the order, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the Majority Leader to speak to the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Pro Tem, if you got the rainmaker over there, could you tell him we're good for a little bit? He can back off. Hey, what we bring before you, sitting on your desk, is Senate Resolution 935. This is the adjournment calendar that we've been waiting on up to this point. We had to see how the budget process went through the House side. We know that it's on the floor for them today, and then we have a limited amount of time between now and the day 40 for our appropriations chair to go through the multiple changes and revisions that we've seen coming out of the House's budget. The timeline, the committee process, the appropriations committees, all that's very synchronized right now, and we need to pass this resolution so that we can lock it in so that we know where we're going and how we're going to get there. The House does not agree with this resolution. There'll be further things come. This is the Senate's version that we have placed before them. We think it's conservative. We think it's appropriate, and I would urge your support. Thank you.
Senator has yielded the well. Does any other senator wish to speak for or against the resolution? The chair sees none. Is there objection or agreeing to the report of the committee which is favorable to the adoption of the resolution? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Is there objection to the main question being ordered? The chair hears none and the main question is ordered. Questions on the adoption of the resolution. All those in favor of the resolution will vote yea. Opposed, nay. The secretary will unlock the machine. On the adoption of the resolution, the yeas are 51, the nays are 0. This resolution, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore adopted. All right, we're going to move on to the rules calendar. We are going to move on to the rules calendar. Mr. Secretary, can you please read the caption of Senate Bill 386?
Senate Bill number 386 by Senator Unterman of the 45th and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend Article 33 of Chapter 2 of Title 20 of the OCGA relating to the Georgia Special Needs Scholarship Act so as to revise the prior school year requirement, to expand eligibility for students, to revise the basis for calculating scholarship amounts, to require annual parent surveys, and a complaint procedure for scholarship calculations and for other purposes. Mr. President, on March 4th, 2020, the Senate Committee on Education and Youth recommends that this bill do pass by substitute. Respectfully submitted by Senator Martin of the 9th Chair. Mr. President, the Senate Committee on Education and Youth offers the following substitute to Senate Bill 386, a bill to be titled an act to amend Article 33 of Chapter 2 of Title 20 of the OCGA, like the Georgia Special Needs Scholarship Act, so as to revise the prior school year requirement, to expand eligibility for students, to revise the basis for calculating scholarship amounts, to require annual parent surveys, and for other purposes. Mr. President, Senator Unterman of the 45th offered the following amendment number 1 to amend Senate Bill 386 substitute by striking line 116, inserting XXT, any rare disease identified by the National Institutes of Health, Genetic and Rare Disease Centers list of rare disease disorders, remunerate accordingly. Mr. President, Senator Martin of the 9th and others offers the following amendment number 2. Amend the Senate Committee on Education and Youth substitute to Senate Bill 386 by striking on line 4, quote, require a complaint, and inserting in lieu thereof, quote, for a review. By striking line 5 and inserting in lieu thereof the following calculations to provide for. By striking lines 157 through 179 and inserting in lieu thereof the following. Subject to public review and comment, And 2, the department shall post on its publicity accessible website the basic unit cost for general instructional programs as a minimum estimate for scholarship amounts. The department shall provide parents of scholarship students the actual scholarship amounts and for other purposes. Mr. President, the fiscal notice is attached. That completes order, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 45th to speak to Senate Bill 386.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate. I bring before you Senate Bill 386 as a substitute. It's my honor and privilege to have been here in the year 2007 and vote and help write the original Georgia Special Needs Scholarship Program. Probably every one of you in this room, you already know how you're going to vote on this bill. And I'm very appreciative of that. And I know that some of you, it's a very difficult vote. And I'm very, very appreciative because I know what it's like to go back home and defend your votes. On its surface, this is a very simple bill. And it's a simple bill because it's been around for a long time and we already know the foundation of it. This does not dramatically change an existing program beyond what was its original intent, which is to provide an opportunity, an educational opportunity for students with special needs. Now, I can't stand up here and tell you that I have been on the Education Committee for years and years and years and know everything that you that sit on that committee are specialists in. But what I am a specialist in is special needs. And I have spent a lifetime of taking care of people with special needs. And that's why in my heart, I am just so emphatically want to promote people with special needs have more opportunities. The Georgia Special Needs Scholarship Program was created in Senate Bill 10, and everyone recognizes that historic bill in 2007. And currently, even though everybody said the sky was going to fall and the public school systems in the state of Georgia were going to collapse, it only covers about 5,000 students in the whole state of Georgia, which is only about 2% of the eligible students. So that means a lot of parents and a lot of students, not only have they been served in the past in their current school system, but in the future they will probably be served there too. This program has been meaningfully updated, and it has become evident through hearing from parents that there are things that could be changed to make the program work better for those it will intend to serve. So if you look at 2007 to 2020, this is the first revision of this particular bill. And when I was sitting in the Education Committee and the Senate Education Committee, I saw parent after parent after parent sitting down at the table, and if I closed my eyes, I could see myself sitting at that table and describing my own family's history. And it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy when you see your child sinking, and when you go to the public school system and you tell them that you know that your child has difficulty, and you think they're listening, and for a year or more you try to explain that and you beg for help, and then they finally agreed the year after that, yes, I'll do an IEP, an individual educational plan for that child. But then in the third year, that IEP gets developed and it gets done. So that's a 3-year window in a child's life. And as a parent, it's excruciating because you know your child desperately needs help. You know that your child is coming home every day and is being tormented and possibly bullied because they're the last child in the class. I know because I've been there, and I know that a mother will fight and fight and fight for anything for the life of their child and for what is best for their child. And not just a mother, but also a father. And that's exactly what this bill aims to do. Specifically, Senate Bill 386 seeks to ensure all students with special needs are eligible in the program. The current law excludes certain students with special needs. The current law excludes those students with special needs. It ensures accurate funding of scholarships. It allows students with special needs. In committee, they were talking about an ingrown toenail. Give me a break. I'm talking about kids that can't read and write and do math, that are adopted from foster care to enroll in the program immediately. It allows public special needs preschoolers to count towards the one-year public school requirement. It allows students who have participated in the program to re-enter the program without completing an additional year in public school. And this is where that critical 3-year window that I was talking about years ago that was so crucial, and that's what we're aiming to fix. It increases transparency for families and requires feedback from parents to measure the impact of the program. This bill does not expand the current program beyond students with special needs. It specially ensures that all students with special needs can participate. Most of the arguments against this bill actually came from an underlying opposition to the existing program. And I understand that, and I understand there's very few in here that were in here with Senate Bill 10 and Senate Bill in 2007. So I can tell you, I've heard from educators out in the hall, I've heard from superintendents, well, we really don't oppose this bill. But we feel like it's the camel's nose under the tent and that you're eroding the public school system. Well, if it were the camel's nose under the tent, then when we originally wrote the bill in 2006 and 2007, the system would have collapsed by now. And guess what? It hasn't collapsed. As a matter of fact, the public school systems in the state of Georgia have thrived and grown. Despite the claims made in 2007 against the creation of the Georgia Special Needs Scholarship, since that time, public school funding, we're very proud to say, is at an all-time high. Teachers have gotten pay raises, and most students with special needs are still being served by their traditional public school. And as a matter of fact, some of those traditional public schools accept people from the outside in other counties to come into their county to be able to help them. But there still are a few thousand kids who have used the program, the scholarship program, and it has been a life-saving, God-send program. And we heard those mothers testifying committee. I want to tell you the case of Jackson Fonzo. Jackson was held back in his public school kindergarten when he could not read or write like his peers, just like my own son. He was held back, just like my own son. It was at the end of his second time attempting kindergarten that his parents pushed, and he was diagnosed with dyslexia. Jackson was then given an IEP that had 4 goals. At the end of his second year, second year, Jackson had those same 4 goals, and guess what? He made no progress. I can tell you the tears on that child's face and the tears on those mothers and dads at nighttime when they're trying to figure out what's going to happen to my son. I've been there. I've sat on that bed. I know what that feeling's like. That's when Jackson's mother found out about the Georgia Special Needs Scholarship, also called the SB10 waiver. She was connected with a school called the Academy of Innovation and discovered they had a plan for helping her son succeed. Jackson started his 3rd grade year there last year, and in his very first semester, he made more progress than the previous 4 years combined, and that's a godsend. Senate Bill 10 was a life changer for Jackson. And Jackson is not the only one. This program has really not been around long enough that we have been able to see what happens to students who have opportunity. Cameron Smith was a student, is a student with cerebral palsy, was in the inaugural class of students who used this scholarship. And guess where Cameron is today? Cameron graduated last year with high honors from Reinhardt University. All this bill does is make an existing program work for families and ensure that all kids with special needs have access to the very program designed to help them. It's my honor and privilege to not only have been here in the year 2007 and to see this program prosper, to help these individual families, to talk about people like Cameron, who has graduated from a university. Unfortunately for my very own son, he never graduated from high school. He never graduated from high school. He did get a GED. But there are many, many other children out there, and this is our responsibility as legislators to give every child an opportunity. It's not a cookie-cutter school system. There are people and families who operate outside of the box. I was so moved and I was so grateful for those families that came down to the state capitol and testified in this committee. I also want to say thank you to the Education Committee. I really never understood the yeoman's work that you all do. We have a great chairman with the chairman of the 9th, the senator from the 9th. He's given me a lot of guidance on this. And if when we go through this debate process, if I cannot answer those questions, I'm sure those authorities on those committees can answer it. Maybe I can answer your questions about the diagnosis and about raising children with different diagnoses. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I think I'll yield the well, and I'll be available and answer any questions.
Do you yield for a question?
Yes.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 27th for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Chairman, do you yield?
Yes, sir.
I caught something you said, and I would like to follow up with that as it relates to the fiscal note that's on our desk. You stated earlier that SB 10, so the current special needs scholarship, which has been in place for over a decade,
that's correct,
of the currently available student pool that could participate in that, only 2% of students available to participate in that do participate in that. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I believe that is correct. And if you look on your desk, here's the auditor's report. And I think it's because the school systems, some of the school systems, they do they do fulfill the needs of individual students, and students do stay in their individual school systems. But there are opportunities for others that want to step out of the box, and that's what this bill strives to do.
Do you further yield?
Yes.
The fiscal note, whereas the current utilization is at 2%, the fiscal note provides estimates for 10, 20, and 30%. Do you have any idea why the fiscal note does not include the actual usage, which is currently 2%?
No, I don't know. I think they were looking at numbers and projecting and seeing what is the uppermost. I do think that even the 10% is unrealistic. And when you get up to 30%, I have no idea why they did that.
Do you further yield?
Yes, I do.
I'm not a math whiz, but isn't it true that if this scholarship were to be used at the same utilization as the current special needs scholarship, that the cost would actually be 10% of the 20% and therefore less than $2 million?
That's exactly right. And when you consider the state budget of billions of dollars, it's a minuscule amount.
Do you further yield?
Yes.
Isn't it true that we currently spend not $2 million that this would cost, but that we currently spend $10,000 million educating students in the state of Georgia, and that the $2 million is a very, very small fraction of the $10,000 million?
Yes, sir. I believe after helping to write the budget for all these years with the senator from the 4th, that when you calculate the K through 12 education, and then you calculate the healthcare cost in the state of Georgia, and then God knows you put in the Board of Regents into that, it's a very, very small, minuscule amount of money, not only in this program, but the money that we have to actually operate the rest of the state of Georgia. And I appreciate you bringing that up.
Do you continue to yield?
Yes.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 48th for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Does the senator yield?
Yes.
I'm very sensitive to the needs of our students, but I am concerned about the cost of this program, particularly when I have seen differing numbers now. The senator just shared with us the 2% number. The fiscal note shares with us numbers up to $29 million. I'm concerned that a fiscal note doesn't actually, the fiscal note is supposed to give us the best information available, correct?
Well, I've been here for a long time, and fiscal notes can reflect a lot of different things, and it really depends on who asked for the fiscal note.
Do you further yield?
Yes.
Did you actually ask for the fiscal note?
No, it did not.
Okay, so the 2% number that was brought out by the senator from the 27th, where does that number come from? I'm not seeing that in my documentation.
I believe that is some of the documentation. If you look at the Board of Education, the State Board of Education, in the abundance of caution, we have a lot of transparency in these programs. And I believe the State Board of Education has issued letters and numbers, and you can look at the last fiscal years and see those numbers, and that's where that number's generated from.
So that's where the 2,000 is from?
Just like I said, I think you can look back through those numbers and find them.
Matt, do you further yield?
Yes.
So just to be clear here, though, I have from the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute that there are some 5,000 students currently using the voucher program, and that some 30,000 students could qualify under your bill. Therefore, estimates may go up to $90 million.
Well, Senator,
so that is not consistent with what I'm hearing here today. So I'm just trying to understand the best numbers possible to make the best decision possible for the people of Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Senator, I think it's what I alluded to when I was talking and gave the introduction of the camel's nose under the tent, and that you have to be realistic. And the Georgia Public Policy Budget Institute is an outside agency, I believe. And I'm not sure where they get their numbers from. I'm not sure I feel confident in any of these organizations that give us numbers other than the state of Georgia. You have to understand they're either left-leaning or right-leaning, and however they want to calculate or miscalculate or present their numbers, they're often biased.
And do you further yield for one last question?
Sure.
I don't see where this legislation provides for the reevaluation for students with 504 plans who use this scholarship. Would students with 504 plans for temporary injuries like broken bones be eligible to continue to claim this scholarship after their condition, is resolved, such their arm is healed?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that was specifically addressed in the committee meeting, because after the committee meeting and even during the committee meeting, people were talking about broken bones and broken noses, and they were talking about ingrown toenails and they get infected and you can't walk. So in the committee, we actually moved the goalpost, and the chairman was very wise, and we came back the next week and we put in specific diagnosis. And I think a diagnosis of a temporary malady like a broken arm is quite different. It's quite different than cystic fibrosis, deafness, Down syndrome, drug or alcohol abuse, sensory impairment, dyslexia, behavior disorder, epilepsy, hearing impairments, which the chairman has worked for so many years on mandates for hearing aids, intellectual disabilities, muscular dystrophy, specific learning disabilities, spina bifida, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment. And I actually have an amendment on your desk that addresses rare disorders, genetic disorders. Now, I think it's a misnomer. I think it's a shame that you have to throw these fireballs into this debate, that you have to throw in ingrown toenails with someone who suffers from spina bifida. I think it's a very, very poor debate, and I think it's a disservice to these children and to these families that you trivialize these disorders. These are lifetime disorders. Someone asked me about drug or alcohol abuse, that's not a permanent disorder. Well, if you've ever been through the 12-step program, once you're an alcoholic, you're always an alcoholic. And you say, I've been clean and free and sober for the past 12 years. And everybody claps their hands. That's a good thing. Because can you imagine a child? And we have so many children that are going through alcohol and drug abuse right now. God bless them. And God bless them if their parents acknowledge it and they think that their existing school program is not helping them, and they see a light at the end of the tunnel, and they can go to a private school and they can get more individualized therapy. God bless them if we save one child from suicide. We have some of the highest suicide rates in the nation in Georgia. I remember the GBI testifying in one of my committees about a little girl who stood in the train tracks in front of a train. If we're saving one child with this special needs waiver, oh my gosh, that's like saving a lifetime to me. You're putting a family back together again. You're giving them hope for the future instead of being bullied and all the other negative things that go with them. When Georgia has one of the highest rates of people not graduating from high school, why don't we do everything in our power instead of talking about ingrown toenails and give them every tool in the toolbox to be able to succeed? That's what I'm here for. I don't know what y'all are here for, but I'm not worried about that camel under the tent. I'm not worried at all because that tent hadn't fallen in so far, and it's not going to be blown away again. And these false numbers that are put on your desk, they're not valid numbers. We have proof. We have transparency. The Board of Education can give you these numbers.
Madam
With
Chair,
that,
as a dyslexic, I take this very seriously.
Well, Mr. President, I'll be glad to answer any other questions that might be a little bit more substantive, but I think that this line of questioning is redundant, and I'll be glad to close out the debate.
Thank you. As a dyslexic,
Senator has
I
yielded
take
the
this
well.
very seriously. Thank you. As a dyslexic, I do take this
Senator
very
from the
seriously.
48th would please cease.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 42nd to speak to the bill. Chair recognizes the senator from the 42nd to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. First off, I have to disclose that I'm sympathetic to the families of special needs kids that see a measure of hope in private school vouchers. You see, I am the mother of a special needs child. My husband and I picked our neighborhood with plans to send our kids to the very good local public school. But then our older son started to be much more of a challenge. He got worked up very easily. He had tantrums. Our first diagnosis was sensory processing disorder. Later came the ADHD diagnosis. When he was 4 years old, he attended 4 different preschools in a 6-month period as we struggled to find the right environment for him. He ended up thriving in a family care daycare that had only 6 children. When it was time for kindergarten, my husband and I decided that our 800-child elementary school would be too much for him to handle. We knew that he'd be neurologically overwhelmed and be a behavior problem. We settled on the smallest non-special needs private school we could find, and it's worked very well. So yes, I'm sympathetic to the intent of this bill because I believed the smaller environment was better for my ADHD kid. There's a way that we could do a special needs voucher that might get my support, but the program in this bill is ripe for abuse and sets up a system where wealthy families in Metro Atlanta can get a private school education at the expense of rural and working class Georgians. Let's start with the fact that the obligation of this body is to provide an adequate public education for all children. The Georgia Constitution says that the provision of an adequate public education shall be a primary obligation of the state of Georgia. This bill seems to be evidence that we're apparently not living up to that obligation for many children. If my local public school wasn't so huge, with such big class sizes, maybe it could better serve the needs of my son and other kids with ADHD. We have abysmal ratios of students to counselors and social workers in our state. That is a problem for all kids in the public schools. And this bill does nothing for that. In fact, it makes it worse because it puts more public money in private schools. And worse than that, this bill makes it so families like mine can get a subsidized private school education on the dime of working class people throughout this state. The average family currently using the program, SB 10, is white and in Metro Atlanta. They're also obviously in fairly decent shape financially. The average voucher currently is about $5,000. And by the way, that number will drop under this new expansion because as the fiscal note from the Department of Audits and Accounts on our desk points out, special needs kids that can currently get this program are classified as special needs because they have to have an IEP, an individualized education program. They tend to receive, or do receive, larger QBE amounts than Section 504 kids. This bill expands that program to Section 504 kids, a much larger group, which is why the fiscal note comes up with the dollars it does, or kids that get a diagnosis from a psychologist, even more open-ended than a 504 designation. So even with that, the voucher will be about $3,000. That does not come close to meeting the tuition amounts for Metro Atlanta private schools. What that means is it can only be used by families that already have a decent amount of disposable income. As I was just saying, 504 plans are much easier to get than IEP plans, and therefore they are much more easily abused. A New York Times investigation found that in our country's richest neighborhoods, the share of high school students with a 504 designation was double the national average. Why is that? Well, when you have a 504 designation, you can have more time on tests and other supports that can increase your academic performance. Affluent, educated parents know this, and they can afford to pay thousands of dollars out of pocket to have their children evaluated by a neuropsychologist to get an ADHD designation. That's what my husband and I were able to do for our son. Under this bill, you don't even need a 504. All you need is the doctor's note. Wealthy families have the knowledge, time, and money to get these for any of their kids that are struggling in a way that middle and lower income families simply can't afford. You can't access a neuropsychologist unless you're, at least not readily, unless you are ready to pay between $3,000 and $5,000 out of pocket right then and there. By the way, this is the exact same designation that Hollywood celebrities Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin used, along with others, to begin cheating their kids into college. Wealthy families that know how to work the system, and I'll be honest, I'll include families like mine, will be far and away the primary beneficiaries here. And this bill has even better news for me and my family. Not only will working class Georgians pay to help defray the cost of my son's private education, but my son will actually get more taxpayer money over his schooling career than a student who can't afford to take advantage of the program. If my son entered this program in first grade, the higher level of funding QBE gives to younger elementary school age children versus high school children will follow him throughout his career as he ages. So the farmer, the taxi driver, the waitress, the workers in the manufacturing plants throughout our state, their kids won't get as much taxpayer money toward their education as my child will. We are sending the message that we care a lot more about the education of wealthy families in Metro Atlanta than we do about everyone else. Last year, we voted for the first time to test young elementary kids for dyslexia. That we only funded to the tune of $100,000 to hire one person to oversee an eventual pilot for whenever we decide to put the money in. So instead of putting the money in to effectuate the program for dyslexic kids, and train teachers on the reading programs necessary to help, we are instead picking something that will only help a very, very small percentage of kids. Instead of the 15 to 20% of children that we know would be helped if we actually funded the legislation we passed last year. We could help thousands of kids by moving forward with a structured literacy program. My husband and I can afford to pay for private school and for all of the therapies our son has needed. I should be grateful that me and my husband could save at least $54,000 for our son's education under this. But giving us that money that could be used by families that need it or to improve our public schools is unquestionably a bad use of taxpayer money. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm happy to answer any questions.
You have no questions.
Thank you. I yield the well.
Thank you, Senator. Before we move on to the next, I want to recognize a very special guest of ours, former Governor of Mississippi, Haley Barbour, is with us on the chamber floor. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, can you please read amendment number 3 for us?
Mr. President, Senator Martin of the 9th and Williams of the 39th offer the following amendment number 3 to amend the substitute to Senate Bill 386 by inserting after line 179, 4, the department shall collect and report information on the scholarship student retention rate for each participating private school and for the program in total and disaggregated by race and gender. The average number of years students receive a scholarship, the percent of scholarship students who return to public schools annually and what grade levels, and the assessments used by private schools to measure student academic progress. That completes order, Mr. President. Recognize the minority leader. Chair recognizes the minority leader to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. The last speaker pointed out a lot of good points about this having obstacles in rural areas, about people that have wealth can benefit from this much more than those that don't have transportation or the money to add to any school scholarship to go to a private school. You know, we see some problems with it. I'm here mainly to remind you of an underlying problem of this bill, and that's our commitment to public education. You know, Georgia is already 34th in the nation in funding. We're $1,996 below the national average in education funding in this state. What we should be doing as a body is committing ourselves to our K through 12 schools and making sure that every student has these opportunities, not carving out small groups of people that have the resources to add to a school scholarship and make their lives better. We as a body should be focusing on making everyone's lives better, not leaving out the rural areas or leaving out the poor. And we can do that, ladies and gentlemen, senators, we can do that, but it needs your commitment. Today, we're looking at adding to more people added to a list that can use a scholarship program that really can only be accessed by those with additional funds to go to private school, and that is problematic. And the true problematic nature is that as we get more and more people out of your traditional public school system, you lower the commitment of this body and you lower the political forces on our General Assembly to fund public education and make sure Georgia education is the best in the country. Georgia should not continue to be 30th or in public education rankings or 34th in funding. We should be moving up. And we shouldn't be supporting legislation that takes us away from that goal or distracts us or leaves some students behind. Mr. President, I yield the well if there's any questions.
You have no questions.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 37th to speak to the bill or the amendments.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. I want to first say I'm not opposed to the special needs scholarship. I think it meets some needs of many, many children that cannot be met or those needs that are not being met in a public school setting. I want to be clear. I'm not getting paid by the minute and I'm not getting paid by the word, so this is not going to take very long. First, I think we have a responsibility to meet the needs of all of our students with disabilities that cannot be met in a public school. That's clear. Secondly, I think we need to make it easier for students with disabilities to receive an IEP in those public schools. All that being said, I think we need to go back to the original intent of SB 10 of the Special Needs Scholarship. It was originally designed for students with a verified physical, emotional, or behavioral disability of a permanent nature. Think about that now, it's permanent nature. Through the years, there have been numerous attempts to breach the gap on the Special Needs Scholarship. The last one I presided over, there was an attempt to pay a special needs scholarship to students who don't speak the English language. That is not a physical, emotional, or behavioral disability. That's not even a learning disability. That's a lack of instruction. But there's been many attempts to breach the criteria of this. I have some concerns with the bill as it's currently drafted, and I'll be very brief. Number one, there is no mandatory academic or physical improvement evaluation of the student's experience. We talk about transparency. We have all kind of measures of support, of scrutiny of public schools and how well they're doing their jobs. But we don't have this kind of scrutiny when this goes to private schools. Secondly, this bill is not revenue neutral. Says that the student earns the same amount of money they would have earned in a private school. Yet in a private school, there'd be a deduction for a local 5-meal share. Thirdly, the students that enter this program are permanently vested in this program. Once they're in, they're permanently in until graduation. And they are paid at the initial funding level, even if they went in as a kindergarten student, which is the highest funding rate. And they continue to be paid this even if the disability no longer exists. And this is the difference of earning this scholarship for permanent disability or temporal disability. I believe we need to intervene in the lives of children that have learning disabilities, but I'm not sure that it takes a permanent scholarship to accomplish that. If there are no IEPs available, I think qualification into this program needs to be done by an appropriate diagnosis by a medical specialist in the field of the specific diagnosis. Not just any physician should not qualify to get his kid in this program. And lastly, I'm afraid that in many cases, as we heard in testimony in committee, the student loses the guaranteed federal protections of the 501 plan if they're in a private school setting. These are my concerns. Mr. President, I yield the well.
Senator has yielded the well. The chair recognizes the senator from the 9th to speak to the bill and his two amendments, number 2 and number 3.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I want to applaud Senator from Beaufort on her efforts on this bill. I think it's very important. I think she speaks from life experience that none of us can possibly, unless you've gone through the same thing she's gone through. You can't speak from those same set of circumstances. And we also heard multiple testimony in the committee. Again, parents speaking from those same circumstances who were able to take advantage of the student special needs scholarship in order to provide the perfect situation for their children, or if not perfect, at least much better. On the whole, our public schools do an excellent job helping almost every single student that they serve, even if they have special needs. We heard earlier, we have just over 250,000 students in Georgia. Under the current law, actually less than 2% of students that have an IEP make use of this scholarship. It's because our schools do a great job. But even though they do a fantastic job for almost every student, there are times when parents face extreme frustration, when maybe there's a disagreement in the school whether their child may need an IEP or not. I talked to people on the ropes, parents on the ropes, whose children, they're double exceptional is what they like to say. They may have autism, but be incredibly intelligent. They don't have a reading disability, but they do have to get certain help in the school day in order to be able to operate within the public school situation. Sometimes that works. There are other times where maybe their situation's a little more extreme and they cannot operate in a large situation. Or as the senator from 42nd said, her student just couldn't make it in the public school. She knows her son. She knows him better than any of us know him, better than any teacher, any administrator. And she made the best decision that she could make. And I applaud her for it. Not everybody can necessarily afford to do that. So when they run into that situation, they're up against a brick wall. I've received calls about this. I know it's helpless. They feel like there's no cooperation. These are not situations where we should be trying to point fingers and find fault. We shouldn't be trying to point fingers at the school system, or the school system shouldn't be pointing fingers back at the parent. This is a situation where we should empower the parent to make the decision in the best possible decision they can make for their child so that their child can be successful. In these instances, time is so important. When you have a first grader, a kindergartner, a second grader, we know that early intervention is so important at these ages when they are still developing their young minds. This is going to empower our students and our parents to make those choices when they otherwise wouldn't be able to do it. There's talk about abuse. The current system shows that there really has not been a lot of abuse. There's talk about oversight. There's talk about reporting. There's actually a report that's issued every single year on the special needs scholarship. I brought them to committee. It's important. I've worked with the senator from the 42nd and the senator from the 39th, I believe, to increase the reporting. I'm okay reinstating those reports that actually had expired, even though they continue to give some of the reports. I'm okay reinstating that and working going forward to make sure there is adequate reporting. I think it's important. It's public dollars. That's amendment number 3, excuse me. Amendment number 2 is when we talked to the the Department of Education during the committee, and they raised some concerns about having the staffing to be able to handle the new reporting that was in the original bill. So this is an amendment that's going to handle that, worked out with them, worked out with the author, and also worked out with the senator from the 42nd in order to make sure the department can continue to do this, and we can also serve parents as well. We know our parents need help when they face difficulty. We know that it can be an impossible labyrinth of federal, state, and local school board bureaucracy. This program has been a success since it passed in 2007. Growth has been steady, not meteoric, probably primary from population growth. And why is that? As I said earlier, our schools do an excellent job of serving our students. Almost every time a family is going to be much better off if they can to be served in the public school situation. There's not going to be a run on vouchers if we pass this bill. There wasn't in 2007 like it was determined there would be. There's not going to be one today. We carefully limited this during the committee process to make sure that we're dealing with permanent diagnoses and permanent issues that these students may face. So you don't have to worry about a temporary broken arm or an ingrown toenail. That's been addressed. I think the senator from the 27th had some good points with regards to the fiscal note. But a fiscal note, the purpose is to give us a range so we can get an idea of how much this is going to cost. And that's exactly what it does. 10%, 20%, 30%. Those are very even numbers that we can interpolate to get down to where we actually believe that the participation is going to be. I think history shows it's going to be right around 2%. Either way, for the most part, it is basically revenue neutral. Not perfectly. I agree with the senator from the 37th. There may be some dollars here or there, but for the most part, it's revenue neutral, as that money would have followed that child into the public school. I ask you now to support this bill. I think it's important for our children with special needs. I've passionately fought for children since I've been in here for the last 6 years, and I will continue to do so. And I think this is a good step to make sure we include all students who are special needs and they have the opportunity to take care of this program. Mr. President, I'll yield for questions. If there are none, I will yield the well.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 36th for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Yield.
I will.
Senator, I think you spoke of the senator from the 42nd's compelling remarks regarding the situation with her young son as they worked as a family to address special needs that he was experiencing in the education realm. What do you say to the point, the basic point that she was stressing was that a family of means can use this scholarship program and have their child in a private school setting, but that it is not available given the gap between public school funding per year per student and the cost of private school, that it's going to be families that can afford to have the money to fill that gap, and that the folks that are left behind are middle class and lower income parents who don't have the money to put with that scholarship to be able to afford the private school. And I asked that, and I will stop and listen to your response. But it's very, very troubling, because if what we're doing is taking public school money, putting it over in private schools for the families that have the most economic advantage, and leaving behind in the public schools the families who can't bridge that gap between the public school funding and the private school education.
I appreciate the question.
Thank you.
And I appreciate you just kind of carrying it out a little longer so I can grab my water here and take a sip.
Drink up.
No, I think it's, so let's talk about that. So, and I don't want to use the senator from the 42nd as an example, but
Sure.
a person of means whose child is already in the private school system, they don't qualify for this program currently, unless they re-enroll their child for a year in public school. So if they're in private school, they'd have to re-enroll their child under the current rules for a year in order to get a $3,000, give or take, under the 504 rules, if that's how they're trying to apply, that's what they would have to do. She also mentioned maybe that you would get a diagnosis. So you would spend $3,000 to $5,000 to get a diagnosis in order to get a $3,000 voucher. I don't think that that's going to happen. I don't think that that makes, I mean, if you're going to go ahead and put your child in a private school, I think that that's just not going to be something that's going to be widespread, but we're going to pay that sort of money in order to get a scholarship that you can already afford if you're that. Now, there are situations where there are parents who can't afford it. But there are also schools that work with these. Schools have financial aid. So a $3,000 credit or scholarship can help bridge the gap for them to qualify along with financial aid in those schools. We heard testimony from parents and students that I don't believe were independently wealthy, and they're taking advantage of the program. You're saying, I don't think we've seen this happen with the IEP under the current program, and I just don't believe it's going to be a massive issue going forward.
Senator, for the
I will.
Thank you. It seems that there's growing agreement, and from what you described in your committee discussion, that the original bill was really lacking in transparency in terms of reporting and to be able to really know the data, to really know the numbers, to know what's the economic status of the families that have enrolled in this program. Isn't that true? I mean, or if I'm wrong,
I
please
don't
correct
necessarily
me.
believe that's true. I think in the law there are some reporting requirements that are already there. I know that a report is issued every single year on the current status of the program, the number of students. It includes some results on how they're doing, if they're making improvements, if they're not, where they come from, how long they've been there, the total number of scholarships. It's a good amount of data. One thing that we noticed was that there was a reporting requirement that had expired in the code, that we should get a report every year. I believe that the Department of Education is continuing with the spirit of that. What I wanted to do was make sure that we go ahead and get that reinstated, because I'm not afraid of the data. I'm not afraid of what we're going to find. I think we're going to find a program that works for our students and that's successful and that allows parents to make the best choice for their students. And that's what it's about, that a parent can make the best choice for their student when they are looking at a brick wall in front of them, they don't know where else to turn.
And further question, if you'll yield.
I will.
And there are really two questions. One, the data that you're referencing, does that allow for any understanding of the economic profiles of the families that have enrolled children?
It does not at this point,
It
Senator.
does not. That's right. So, and then, secondly, what's your concern as the chair of education about the fact that this bill in its original form, SB 10, and currently the bill before us, takes money out of public schools? Public schools have fixed costs: teachers' aides, physical buildings, school bus drivers, transportation, an array, all of those services that are wrapped into public education. And when you remove money from that budget, when you take taxpayer dollars that were slated for public education and you pull it out and put it over in the private schools, do you have concerns? Do you share these concerns about the burden on public education to keep on trucking, to keep on delivering to 90% of Georgia's students in a setting where we're creating a funnel to funnel off public education dollars over into the private schools?
Senator, thanks for the question. I would point back to the bill we passed in 2007. I think the same concerns, if I understand from the senator from the 45th, that she brought up, that those same questions came up, and we're not finding that to be the case. That it's not been a mass exodus. That it's a very small number of students take care of that. And why do they take advantage of that? It's a very small portion of students, because almost every student will be better served in the public schools. And they're going to make that decision to stay in the public school system because it's best for their family. But there are times, and it's less than 2% currently in the current program, and I believe it will mirror that same number probably going forward for our 504 students. There are instances where it's just not the perfect place for that student. It's just not.
Does the
It's
senator?
it's not the fault, it's not the fault of the school. The school does a great job, but it's not perfect. And it gives them the opportunity to find that perfect situation. And I don't believe it's going to be a mass exodus, and I don't believe it'll have a negative impact.
Thank you for taking my questions, and I do think you hear that we are deeply concerned about the impact of this bill on public education funding. Thank you.
You have no more questions.
Thank you. I ask for your favorable consideration of the bill and the amendments. I will yield the well.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 48th to speak to the bill and the amendments.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think it's worth saying that none of us in this chamber would ever oppose helping children who have special circumstances that require attention and accommodation in the classroom. As a child growing up with dyslexia, I am very aware of these circumstances, and I take this bill very seriously. In fact, I'm concerned that we may be moving in the opposite direction if we pass this legislation. The schools that students would be eligible to get a scholarship for under this legislation are not, I repeat, not subject to the same federal regulations that require the accommodations that individual education programs, IEPs, and 504 plans provide. This is part of a slow march towards privatization, and our schools know it. In fact, the Gwinnett County schools have made sure that our entire delegation knows they feel it is the wrong way for our state to go. In fact, it's a forfeiture of students' federally guaranteed civil rights. Let's not continue down this path of abandoning our public school system in favor of unaccountable schools siphoning our tax dollars. I urge you all to please oppose this bill. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the well.
Senator has yielded the well. The chair recognizes the senator from the 45th to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be brief. I ask for your favorable consideration to Senate Bill 386 as a substitute. And just for the record, I'd like the record to reflect a couple of things that I think were misnomers and can be included. Number one, I think Governor Deal and Governor Kemp have done an outstanding job elevating the status of the Georgia public school systems. And one of the ways that they have done it is by hiring and putting into our appropriation, into the budget, additional school counselors and school social workers. And it was very much needed. In addition to that, reforming the foster care system and providing wraparound services to children that desperately need help. And a lot of those kids are these special needs children and their families. So I think we cannot neglect to give them the kudos that they deserve, and also to continue moving forward, to continue funding that and delivering to a system that has to meet those challenges. And they go along with the school bus drivers, the teachers, the superintendents, the whole infrastructure of education. The other thing is, I think there was a comparison here to a Hollywood actress and a movie star. And I have to admit, I'm not up to date on movie stars. But I think it's real interesting that we oftentimes compare what is happening here in Georgia to the West Coast. Well, we found out what good luck that brought us in the last session. And I don't think that's a very good idea to try to transpose those liberal ideas in the state of Georgia, because they're not reflective of our constituency. And with that, I'll close out and say, yes, I appreciate the chairman of the committee and the education committee, and the bill was refined. The senator was asking the changes that were made in committee. The bill was refined, and it included more transparency, because that's what we heard and that's what the committee process is all about. And we all want that accountability. And that accountability rests right across the street at the Sloppy Floyd building with the Georgia Department of Education. And I think they do a good job with telling us those numbers and reflecting on how our school systems are growing in our individual counties. And also, don't forget our individual city school systems. The other thing that was included in the committee process was they did move the goalpost, and I moved the goalpost with them, hoping that they could see the light, even though I knew that they would come in here and vote against this bill. But every diagnosis was added, and I think that's a good thing, and I think it also gives parents a good parameter to know what the inclusion of that diagnosis is. So with these three amendments, I agree with amendment number 1, amendment number 2, and amendment number 3. I agree with those amendments, and I ask for your favorable consideration to the committee substitute. Thank you, and I yield the well.
Senator has yielded the well. All right, we're going to take up the 3 amendments one at a time. We'll start with number 1. The question is on the adoption of amendment number 1. Is there any objection? The chair hears none, and amendment number 1 is adopted. We'll take up number 2. The question is on the adoption of amendment number 2. Is there objection? Chair hears none, and amendment number 2 is adopted. Now we're going to take up amendment number 3. Is there objection to the adoption of amendment number 3? The chair hears none, and amendment number 3 is adopted. The question is on the adoption of the committee substitute as amended. Is there objection to adoption of the committee substitute as amended? Chair hears none, and the committee substitute as amended is adopted. Is there objection to the agreeing of the report of the committee which is favorable to the passage of the bill? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Is there objection to the main question being ordered? Chair hears none, and the main question is ordered. Question is on the passage of the bill by substitute. All those in favor of the bill will vote yea. Opposed, nay. The secretary will unlock the machine. For what purpose does the senator from the 45th rise?
Parliamentary inquiry.
State your inquiry.
Is it not true that a green vote on this bill, Senate Bill 386, is meeting the needs of special needs children throughout the state of Georgia, and it's helping Georgia families?
I'm certain the senator speaks of which she knows. On the passage of the bill, the yeas are 33, the nays are 22. This bill, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore passed by substitute. Chair recognizes the majority leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the Senate immediately transmit Senate Resolution 935 to the House.
This is the adjournment resolution. Is there objection to immediately transmitting? Chair sees none, and the action is taken. Mr. Secretary, can you please read the caption of Senate Bill 415?
Senate Bill number 415 by Senator Gooch of the 51st and others. A bill to be titled an act to amend various titles of the OCGA so as to streamline the process of litigation and reduce costs for Georgia's industries, small businesses, and citizens. To amend Title 9 of the OCGA relating to civil practice. To amend Title 15 of the OCGA relating to courts. To amend Title 36 of the OCGA relating to local government. To amend Title 40 of the OCGA relating to motor vehicles and traffic. To amend Title 44 of the OCGA relating to property. To amend Title 51 of the OCGA relating to torts and for other purposes. Mr. President, on March 3rd, 2020, the Senate Committee on Insurance and Labor recommends that this bill do pass by substitute. Respectfully submitted by Senator Jones, the 25th Chair. Mr. President, the Senate Committee on Insurance and Labor offers the following substitute to Senate Bill 415, a bill to be titled An Act to amend various titles of the OCGA so as to streamline the process of litigation and reduce costs for Georgia's industries, small businesses, and citizens, to amend Title 9 of the OCGA relating to civil practice so as to change certain provisions relating to the tolling of limitations for tort actions while criminal prosecution is pending, to require a judge to provide written responses to jury questions, to provide for disclosure of third-party agreements, to provide for separate trials for issues of liability and damages under certain circumstances, to permit certain instructions relating to damages, and for other purposes. That completes the order, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 51st to speak to Senate Bill 415.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. President. Just a joke. Good afternoon. I guess we're afternoon. Yep. Good afternoon, colleagues. This is a bill that we've been working on for quite some time that you've probably heard a great deal about leading up to today. It's a bill that you don't see very much of in this chamber. And honestly, it's a bill that you probably wouldn't expect to see me up here talking about. It's an issue dealing with our tort system and our civil justice system in our state. I come to you today as obviously the senator from the 51st District, but I'm here today as a father and a spouse and a businessman, a small businessman from the mountains of North Georgia, someone that never practiced law, obviously, but I think it's an issue that's important to all of us as citizens. It's important to the 10.5 to 11 million Georgians who buy goods and products, who buy services every day in our state, who wants to continue to live, work, and play here, to grow their families, go to church and worship, also to have rights protected by our Constitution and by our state laws. But we're seeing a slide in those rights and some of the issues that we've discovered over the past few years. We continue to hear that we're the #1 state to do business, and you will hear some more of that today, I'm sure. But what you're not hearing a lot of is some of the concerns that we have as business people and as landowners, whether you're a farmer on a chicken farm up in the mountains of North Georgia, or if you're a fisherman down on the coast of Georgia, or if you're an insurance agent here in the Atlanta regions or in the suburbs, no matter where you are, these issues are important to all of us, Democrat, Republican, regardless of color. This bill comes to you as an assortment of different codes in our code section. It has the support of 24, 25 some odd senators. It even has support of senator from the 10th, who is a business person. It has support of senators from all over the state from different industries. It has senators that are practicing law in Georgia. This bill originated from a lot of work that took place over last summer. We had a study committee, like many of you travel the state from year to year to listen to input from people back home and around the state. The senator from the 50th District took time and went around the state of Georgia, and I was with him, the senator from the 18th and the senator from the 46th and the senator from the 10th. We traveled far and wide. We went from Brasstown Valley Resort up in the mountains and the highest peaks of our state all the way down to the shorelines of Georgia. And we listened to the people of our citizenry and our businesses asking us questions about how can they help us help them. And so this bill comes to you today as a piece of that work and that effort. The study committee report was filed at the end of the year, like all do, and it's available for you to take a look at. Let me talk a little bit about what the current situation is in Georgia. Georgia's civil justice system is currently one of the most dangerous places for business in the country. You might find that hard to believe, but we believe we are correct on that. We're seeing runaway verdicts becoming more prevalent. They're largely not insurable for small businesses, and they present an essential threat to many Georgia businesses, both large and small. Georgia's insurance rates are some of the highest in the country. Listen to that, some of the highest in the country. Georgia is one of the least profitable places in the country in which to do business if you are an insurer. There are senators in this room that can attest to that. We can have them come up today and they can tell you what I'm telling you is true. The reputation of Georgia's civil judicial system nationwide has never been lower. And you may ask me, or you may ask yourself, how did we get to this point? Well, in 2005, Senate Bill 3 brought partial tort reform to Georgia on a number of critical issues. From 2005 to present, the Georgia General Assembly has been largely resistant to major tort reform measures. The courts have reversed a number of the legislative gains that were a part of SB 3 back 15 years ago. The trial lawyers have aggressively lobbied the General Assembly to prevent new legislation. The trial lawyers have contributed heavily to judicial campaigns at all levels throughout the state. So do businesses. We all know how that works. We all run for office. We all want support from our constituents back home. While the situation deteriorated, the business community sat on its hands and let it happen. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has a rating. They rate all 50 states on the judicial climates in each of the states. We're currently rated 41st out of 50. That's 41 out of 50, 50 being the worst, obviously 1 being the best. In 2012, we were rated 24th. So in just 8 years, we've slid from 24th to 41st. We're now listed on the judicial hellholes list of 2019 and 2020. Let me list those names, the top 10 states that are listed on the judicial hellholes. Number 1 is the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas. Number 2 is California. Number 3, New York City. Number 4, Louisiana. Number 5, City of St. Louis, Missouri. And number 6, Georgia. Number 7 is Cook, Madison, and St. Clair counties, Illinois. Number 8, Oklahoma. Number 9, Minnesota Supreme Court. And number 10, New Jersey. So we're number 6, the top 6 judicial hellholes in the nation. Overall, Georgia is one of the least profitable states in the country to do business for insurance companies. Private passenger liability in 2015, 16, and 17, Georgia was the 49th, and 47th least profitable states in the country, respectively, in which to do business for liability insurers. So in 3 years, 15, 16, and 17, we were ranked 49th, and 47th. These aren't my numbers. These are posted nationwide. Commercial auto liability. In 2015, 16, and 17, Georgia was the 49th, 45th, and 48th least profitable states in the country, respectively, in which to do business with commercial liability insurers. And we all know that the state regulates insurance premiums. These companies cannot continue to take losses. They go over to the insurance commissioner's office and they ask for rate hikes. That impacts everybody in this room. It impacts your children. It impacts your grandchildren. That's just part of the problem. Another part of the problem, violent crimes occur every day in Georgia. Increasingly, the victims are suing the owner of properties where the crimes occur. Every day you look in the Atlanta Journal, there's one on my desk right now. This past Sunday, Lenox Mall, 3 people were shot. I imagine before the year's over, there'll be a lawsuit filed against the owners of the mall, of Lenox Mall. We see crimes like that occurring every day. We have cases that we can talk about where runaway verdicts are continuously being awarded in favor of plaintiffs when the property owners had no control and no blame part of the crime. Courts are awarding tens of millions of dollars against landowners for injuries from the crime, not the criminals who directly are responsible. The person that committed the crime should be held responsible, not the owner of the business who has a parking lot the size of Lenox Mall or Kroger or CVS or Six Flags. These are some of the cases that you'll hear about. Anyone who owns a business or a property is at risk. Anyone, including homeowners, convenience stores, apartment complexes, and of course, grocery stores. I'm going to hit a couple of cases for you, just for some examples. And I'm sure there'll be some debate later about what may or may not have happened in some of these cases. Let's talk about the Kroger case. An attack on the plaintiff occurred in the parking lot of Kroger located on Moreland Avenue here in Atlanta. The fellow was shot 11 times. Kroger had hired a security guard company to monitor security at the store. When the plaintiff arrived at the store, he was immediately attacked by two men who took his wallet and car keys and shot him between 11 and 14 times. The jury awarded $81 million in damages against Kroger, finding Kroger was responsible for 86% of the fault, but finding that the attackers responsible were only 14% liable. So the persons doing the shooting were held 14% of fault, and the person that owns the property where the crime occurred was held 86% of the fault. The CVS case was an attack on a plaintiff that occurred in a CVS parking lot located on Moreland Avenue. Starting to hear some of the patterns. The plaintiff traveled to Atlanta from Alabama to buy and sell refurbished electronics. How many times have you or your spouse bought things off of the internet and you met the person at a local store like a Walmart parking lot to exchange the purchase? Well, this person received a call from a man asking to meet at the CVS parking lot to discuss the sale of an iPad. At the meeting, an unknown man jumped into the plaintiff's car and demanded his wallet. The two men then exchanged gunfire and the plaintiff was injured. The jury awarded $45 million in damages to the victim, with 95% of the fault associated to CVS. The CSX case, y'all remember a few years ago where the film crew was killed on the tracks of CSX. The plaintiff was looking to work on a movie set located on the Doctortown, Georgia Railroad trestle as part of the filming of the Greg Allman biopic Midnight Rider. CSX had previously refused permission to film on its tracks. The film crew went onto the tracks anyhow. A regularly scheduled train operated by CSX interrupted the filming, and the plaintiff was killed when the engineers were unable to stop the train in time. The movie director was convicted of manslaughter and criminal trespass. The jury awarded $11 million in damages, but apportioned the majority of the fault, 35% in that case, to CSX Railroad. And one last one I'll mention, the Six Flags case. The plaintiff attended Six Flags amusement park during the day. After the plaintiff emerged from Six Flags, he traveled to a hotel nearby, and then he returned to the Cobb County Transit bus stop located just off of the Six Flags property. Some 40 to 50 minutes after Six Flags closed its doors and the plaintiff left, gang members attacked the plaintiff at the CCT bus stop, and he was severely injured. The jury awarded $35 million in damages and placed 92% of the blame on Six Flags and only 8% of the blame on the gang members. Now, what are the odds on that? How does this happen? Why does this happen? Well, the victims are sympathetic. Juries are understandably terrified by the crime rates. It is currently easy to bring these claims and claim that the landowner is negligent in failing to protect the victims. The landowner may be found liable if it is reasonably foreseeable that the crime would occur based on prior substantially similar crime in the area. Juries are told at the trial that if they hold the criminal at fault, that the victim will not be fully compensated. Lawyers for the victims are allowed to tell juries not to assign any significant fault to the criminals. What are the consequences of the crisis we are in today? Every property owner in Georgia is at risk. Insurance is increasingly difficult to obtain for these claims, limited or more expensive. Small mom and pop businesses, like the people we talk to every day when we go home, are particularly at serious risk. There will continue to be a lack of investment in the high crime communities that need it the most, creating islands, food islands. You've heard that comment and that phrase. The reputational damage to the business environment for Atlanta and Georgia is significant. Will we continue to be the #1 state to do business? Well, I think that depends on what we do in the future with civil justice reform. Let me mention one other thing about the #1 state to do business, and then I'll go into the details of the bill on a slight note, and then I'm going to turn it over to the senators from the 18th and the senator from the 46th to come up and talk about more specifics in the bill. The #1 state to do business is done by a site selection magazine. I want to read what the criteria is in order to establish who the #1 state for business is. It's not civil justice reform, and it's not the legal environment in the state. The number one issue is workforce skills. Number two, transportation infrastructure. Number three, state and local tax scheme. Number four, ease of permitting and regulatory procedures. Number five, workforce development. Number six, land and building prices and supply. Number seven, utilities, the cost of and the reliability of. Number eight is the right to work state. Number nine, higher education resources. And number 10, quality of life. Nowhere on that list do you hear the legal environment as part of the criteria to become the number one state to do business. So therefore, we'll continue to do that as long as we continue to pass good tax reform and good measures in a pro-business environment. But this issue is critical to the small businesses of Georgia, and it's critical to the rest of us in our quality of lives if we're going to continue to live and raise our children in our state. So let's switch to the bill. The bill is pretty easy to follow if you care to read it. It's broken into different sections. Section 1 is considered the Beneke fix. It allows for the statute of limitations to run even while a criminal is being prosecuted for a crime that caused harm to an individual. Currently, the statute of limitations is tolled until criminal prosecution is complete, which may take up to 6 years. This corrects that. Section 1-2 is a judge must provide jury instructions in writing rather than orally. You would think that was already being done in Georgia. It's done in federal rule, but it's not done in Georgia courts. We want to require that the jurors are given written instructions when the judge gives his instructions to the jury, or she. Section 1-3 requires disclosure of third-party agreements. Those are medical funding agreements, legal agreements, you name it. We just want to see disclosure and transparency in the process. That 1-3A allows for trial bifurcation in civil trials. This deals when you're dealing with liability versus the damages portion of the trial. We want to bifurcate the trials. You'd still have the same jury, you'd still have the same judge. There would not be additional burdens put on the court system by doing so. 1-4 prohibits judges from informing a jury that if the plaintiff is found 50% or more at fault, then the plaintiff is barred from recovery. Part 2 of the bill deals with jury selection. During jury selection, insurance companies will not be mentioned in earshot of others' jurors. Instead, potential jurors will complete a questionnaire to determine whether any relationship exists with an insurance company who has a stake in the outcome of the litigation. I would say if you're sitting in a jury pool and you're being questioned by an attorney, if you have insurance with State Farm or any other insurance company in the state of Georgia, there's a good chance that this case that you're about to hear may have something to do with an insurance case. We believe that should be left in the questionnaire section of the process and be in writing only. Part 3 deals with Joint Airport Authority immunity. In Georgia, there are several joint airport authorities. You have one down in the Macon area close to where the senator from the 20th lives. Currently, the city owns part of the airport. They are not immune from any issues that may arise. However, the county, being the other partner in the airport authority, is already immune, and by law, they are protected. This bill would allow the city and the county to have equal immunity only when it pertains to the airport project itself. It does not extend beyond the airport. Section 4, dealing with trucking reform. Section 4-1 directs action against insurers in trucking cases. Currently, plaintiffs may directly name a motor trucking insurance carrier as a party in a trucking case. The provision prohibits personal injury lawyers from suing motor trucking companies, insurance carriers, prior to the adjudication of a case against the trucking company. Georgia is a minority of states with this current law. Very few states allow you to sue the trucking company and the insurance company at the same time in the case. Nowhere else in our statute that I'm aware of are you allowed to name the insurer in a civil case in Georgia. Section 4-3 and 4-4, presumption of qualifications with valid commercial driver's licenses. A person should be presumed to possess the qualifications necessary to be hired and entrusted to drive a commercial motor vehicle if the person has a commercial driver's license issued by a state in accordance with the minimum federal standards for the issuance of commercial motor vehicle driver's licenses, if the license is not suspended, revoked, or canceled, and if the person is not disqualified from driving a commercial motor vehicle. This does not let anyone out of doing a DMV check. All the background checks, all of your private companies will continue to have to do whatever their HR policies are on that. This simply just says that insurance companies are part of this case, and that if driver's license is enough qualifications, if they meet all the federal standards and all of the state standards, once they get that commercial driver's license, then they are qualified to drive that truck. Part 5 is known as a seatbelt evidence rule. You've heard this argument more than one time in this chamber. This continues to be an issue. We believe that not wearing a seatbelt should be allowed into a courtroom and should be evidence in a trial, just like if you get hurt on the back of a motorcycle and you're not wearing a helmet, that is already part of evidence in a case today. We believe that this should be included as well with seatbelts. Part 6, it's the Georgia Medical Funding Act, requires disclosure of all funding documents to injuries and insurers when medical services are funded by third parties in any case. Simply discloses it. Doesn't prohibit it, doesn't put limits on it. All we're asking for is disclosure. Part 7, statute of repose and failure to warn cases. A statute of repose is a period of time in which a plaintiff may file a suit. The legislature enacted a 10-year statute of repose in product liability cases and made no exceptions. But the courts created a failure to warn exception not authorized by the legislature. The judicially imposed exception to failure to warn cases, known as constructive notice, effectively renders the 10-year statute of repose against manufacturers meaningless. Georgia should revive the actual notice standard and limit claims to 10 years as the statute was originally intended by this legislature years ago. Section 7-2, landowner liability protection. Landowners are currently being sued as a result of third-party criminal activity occurring on their property when the landowner neither permitted nor had any knowledge of the criminal conduct, and in many cases had taken steps to prevent it by implementing security measures and mechanisms. Runaway verdicts against innocent landowners have been the result, which we believe have caused businesses to abandon high-crime areas and therefore creates food deserts and other economic vacuums. We talked about that in several of the examples I mentioned earlier. Section 7A-1 is truth and damages. Currently under Georgia law, a defendant is prohibited from telling a jury how much medical treatment actually costs for a plaintiff's injuries. The plaintiff is able to introduce evidence of the initial billed amount by a medical provider when the actual amount paid to fully satisfy the debt, usually through health insurance coverage, so forth, is substantially lower in most cases. Even when no one actually pays the billed amount, the plaintiffs are permitted to use or inaccurately inflate numbers to quantify the costs of the plaintiff's medical treatment. The same phantom number is then used as a multiplier for non-economic damages. This results in vastly inflated recoveries. This is known as phantom damage claim that we heard last year from the senator from the 46. And last is Part 7B, dealing with asbestos bankruptcy transparency. In asbestos cases, plaintiffs have successfully made multiple claims for the same asbestos-related injuries, which results in recoveries against multiple companies for the same injury. This legislation would simply require that the plaintiffs disclose all exposures, which will provide for proper and equitable allocation at fault. Again, disclose, transparency. We're not prohibiting and we're not limiting, we're asking for disclosures. That is a very quick run through of the bill. I hope to give ample time to the senators from the 46th and 18th to come up and take a stab at some of the deeper dive issues that some of you may have questions for. So with that, Mr. President, I'll take questions at this moment, and then I'll yield for the other senators that want to speak.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 3rd for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the senator yield for a series of questions?
Yes, sir.
Senator, you mentioned that there are a good many of senators that support this bill in your opening discussion here. But would you agree that there are also a good many of senators that have concerns with the bill?
Yes, sir. I would say that is a true statement, and I would say also, Senator, that anytime we open up this title section, we almost always break out into a multi-hour discussion between the defendants and the plaintiffs and the his and the hers and those nots. And so we may be here for hours again today, but it's always a good, healthy debate to have these discussions, and I hope that at the end of the day, you'll support the bill.
Well, I agree it's always healthy to have a lot of discussions on an issue as important as this, but I would like to go back to discussions that may have been had in the study committee, and you mentioned that there was a study committee. How many of the senators on that committee would have been ones that would have had concerns with the bill?
Well, I would say after the year that we spent, not quite a year, but the time that we spent traveling the state, there were a lot of issues that came forth that the lawyers that were on the committee didn't agree with. And so they were pushing back on issues. They didn't necessarily agree that that was a good idea to put in this measure, that we could have gone a lot farther in a lot more detail with this legislation than what we did based on the study committee findings. But we feel like we're trying to move our number from 41, which is almost the worst in the nation, back somewhere toward the middle. Some common sense swing back to the center, not to the far left or the far right.
But those lawyers that you just mentioned, those would be ones that would be supporting the bill today, and certainly there are others that would oppose the bill. They were not a part of that process.
There was another attorney on the committee that was not an elected official who did oppose a lot, if not most, of the measures that we have in this bill. He has not reached out to us since that committee adjourned in December. But I felt like he was very helpful in our discussions and kept us on task and listening to both sides of the argument.
I guess my concern is there may be some perspectives and some issues which maybe could have been addressed by the study committee, which perhaps could have brought a little more balance to the bill. And in that regard, I'd like to just ask you about one little aspect of that.
Certainly.
If you would look at in lines 36 through 42, we're making a significant change to the law. Right now, if a crime is committed, there is a tolling of the statute of limitations not to exceed 6 years if a crime is committed. But we're changing that now to a felony. Now, Senator, isn't it true then that tolling is there because while a crime is being committed, a plaintiff may not have access to the information in a prosecutor's file, and that information could be relevant to his case and to that plaintiff being made whole. Would you agree with that?
If you say so, Senator.
And also, a defendant in a deposition, he could plead the Fifth Amendment because if he's asked about how an accident occurred, let's say a car accident, and he might be excused from testifying about that, correct?
If you say so, Senator. I'm not an attorney, but.
And so basically what we're doing is we're eliminating that tolling for misdemeanors.
Mm-hmm.
And would you agree that there are some misdemeanors that occur in the state that can have serious consequences on innocent people, such as DUIs or reckless driving, things such as that?
I would say you know of which you speak, but also I would remind you that this chamber, while you and I weren't here when this originally passed, this was language in Georgia law, and the court struck it down, and so we're simply restoring that language, maybe slightly modified. So I would say that, it was good enough for us back in the day that we felt like it was a needed change, although the courts came back later and struck it. I believe it's worthy of having that discussion today to put it back the way we would like to have it in our state.
So why wouldn't we include misdemeanors in that as well?
That'll be a good question you would want to ask our fellow senators that have come after me.
That might have been a perspective.
Yes, but I think it's because it's most of the misdemeanors dealing with smaller claims in the tort system in Georgia. We're trying to speed up the efficiency of the court, trying to streamline some of the processes and not drag them out for 6 to 10 years. As you know, some of these cases can be extended in court into the future, and a lot of your witnesses no longer around and so forth and so on. So there's probably some better reasons that the attorneys in the room would give you, but that's the one that I would.
You might agree then that it might be helpful, at least in DUIs or reckless driving cases, to toll that statute of limitations to hurt victims of those crimes that can be seriously injured.
You would probably make a good argument with the senator on the 46 on that, since he specializes in some of that area of the law.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Do you continue to yield?
One more question, then I want to make room for our friends.
Chair
to
recognizes
follow.
the senator from the 45th for a question.
Thank you. Mr. Whip, would you please yield?
I sure will.
Senator, I wanted to ask you about the asbestos. It's very near and dear to my heart because I had 2 family members who had complications from exposure to asbestos. I was wondering if you were concerned about veterans, because veterans have such a long history of perhaps being exposed to asbestos in their prior history. And then, you know, those symptoms don't manifest until you get like lung cancer, maybe in your 40s and 50s. And are you saying that in this asbestos clause that they would have to disclose and then maybe they go to court and maybe that would be held as prejudice against them and they're a veteran serving their country? Should they not be compensated?
I think any victim should be fairly compensated, Senator, but I think that if a person files multiple claims over the years, then that should be, in my opinion, should be produced as evidence in a civil trial where parties are suing one another. I would think that if they're not trying to hide it, then they should disclose it. And so I think that's a fair balance on both parties, and it wouldn't be necessarily favoring one over the other.
Senator, your allotted 30 minutes has expired in the well.
Parliamentary inquiry, could he just answer one more question about, just one more question?
Senator has
same
the
line of
opportunity to
thought.
answer. This is your final question.
Go ahead.
And your time has expired.
Thank you, thank you. I just wanted to ask you about firefighters because, you know, some professions have a known history of exposure to different chemicals. You know, it's just part of their job.
Right.
And these are the people that are protecting and serving all of us. And why should they be penalized? I just don't understand that.
There's nothing in this bill that would penalize any citizen of Georgia for the asbestos claims. Simply, all it does is requires for the disclosure of any other claims. We want to protect our firefighters, we want to protect our veterans, and we want to protect all victims that are duly needed for assistance. So, thank you, Senators, for your consideration, and we'll look forward to closing.
Senators yielded the well. Mr. Secretary, will you please read the amendment number 1 that has arrived?
Cowser to the 46th and Dolezal the 27th. Offer the following amendment number 1 to amend the committee substitute to Senate Bill 415 by inserting at the end of line 461, 4. Nothing in this code section shall be construed to limit the provisions of 22 U.S.C. 761. That completes the order, Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from the 46th to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate. Good to be with you today. I can see some eyes that have already glazed over, some people that seem bored, and some that don't even know what these terms are yet, and I apologize for this. This is the mother of all lawyer bills. It's a lot of detail, and it's probably a little tough for some of you to grasp. This is not the best timing probably to come present on this bill when everybody's hungry, been here all morning working and kind of preoccupied to a degree with all the 20-some odd bills on our calendar today, but it's an important issue, and I want to spend just a little time talking about it. And the way we've sort of divided this up, the senator from the 51st is the business community, and he understands how this is impacting business and has taken in proposals and suggestions after the study committee met all over the state and heard from every segment of our citizenry to find out what their concerns are. Myself and the senator from the 18th, being attorneys that deal in trial work, probably have a better grasp of the details of it. It's why he's deferring some questions to us. So some of you may wonder, you know, how did we get here? How has this become a crisis all of a sudden? Why is this business community so up in arms and upset? and asking, really just begging us for relief. You will find on your desk a couple of things that I direct you to. One is a letter from the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, letting you know that this is very important to them this year, and they are lobbying as hard as possible, along with this other group of somewhere over 100 different type of business organizations that need this relief because it is impacting their ability to do business in the state of Georgia. You'll have this on your desk, and we're talking about everybody, from car rental companies to CSX Railroad to Georgia Farm Bureau, the Georgia Apartment Association, the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, the Georgia Association of Manufacturers, General Motors, the Georgia Dental Association, the Georgia Mining Association, the Georgia Poultry Federation, the Georgia Orthopedic Society, the Georgia Restaurant Association, Georgia Retailers, and I'm skipping tons of these, Mag Mutual, the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, National Federation of Independent Businesses, UPS, Piedmont Hospital. It goes on and on because this is impacting every segment of our society. And who's not on this sheet, but who ought to be, is every single driver of an automobile in the state of Georgia. Because our law dictates, it requires that you must purchase automobile liability insurance in order to drive on our roadways, and our rates are now the 8th highest in the United States. Our insurance companies that insure commercial automobiles in the state of Georgia have the 3rd highest underwriting losses in the country. We have the 9th fewest doctors per person in the country. We've got 76 of our counties that don't even have an OBGYN in those counties. And we have estimated that we have $3,631 per household is the cost of our civil justice system on Georgia citizens. You people represent those citizens. They are begging for relief. So why do we have this problem? How did we become a judicial hellhole? How did we, from a state that is most attractive for businesses to come to, have all of these business organizations say, please give us some relief. This is driving up our cost of doing business and running us out of business by having these expenses that we're associating with these liability claims against us. Now, this doesn't mean that we have bad judges in the state of Georgia to be a judicial hellhole. It doesn't mean that we have bad or dumb juries that are giving these crazy awards. It doesn't mean that the gentlemen that have been lobbying you from the plaintiff's bar are bad people. Many of them are my closest friends, and they are representing their clients to seek justice for them. It's based on the fact that we've had an extraordinarily large number of very high, in some cases, irrational type verdicts that have been coming out in the last few years. Now, insurance companies, when they set their rates, they look at what their losses are expected to be. They have people that are underwriters that set their premiums. They have actuaries that do the math and crunch the numbers to see how much they're paying per claim. And I like to tell you, kind of imagine an iceberg, and that tip of it that's up above the waterline represents verdicts. That's these crazy verdicts that you've just heard the senator from the 51st give you, some $40, $100 million verdicts that just seem incredible, unrelated to reality in the case. Well, underneath the waterline are the settlements of these cases. And insurance companies, when they are determining how much to pay out in losses in settlements, they look at what the verdicts have been, and they are seeing these wildly inflated verdicts here. Over 97% of claims for injury are settled without filing a lawsuit. And you can be assured in this state those settlements are very high because the insurers now want to avoid these very high verdicts that we're seeing. I had lunch a few months ago with a dear friend of mine that's a plaintiff's lawyer. He and I have actually worked as co-counsel as plaintiff's attorneys on several cases over the years. And he just in casual conversation said, let me bounce a case off of you. And he gave me the facts of the case and how somebody had been hurt, what their injuries were, and asked me, since I'm mostly doing defense work and I'm all throughout Northeast Georgia, Bill, what do you think this case is worth? And I don't even remember the facts, but I remember saying, you know, if I was defending that, I'd probably offer $700,000, maybe as much as $1 million. It's a significant case. And he started laughing and said, where have you been? He said, you need to see the verdicts that we've been getting in the last couple of years in Georgia, and rattled off 5 or 6. He said, it's a new ballgame. It's a lot more exposure than we used to have. So we started looking to see, why is this happening? Are we suddenly having people that are getting hurt worse than they used to be? Are the medical expenses that much higher? Are there other factors that we're not taking into account? And as it ends up, it's really a very understandable, explainable result of our rules of civil procedure and our rules of evidence that pretty much stack the deck in favor of the plaintiffs. It's not a level playing field. All right, I'm from Athens, and I see our insurance chairman sitting here. He is paying attention, came through his committee. It's like a football game if the plaintiff only has to go 7 yards for a first down, but the defendant has to get 13 yards for a first down. Or the plaintiff gets to have 13 players on the field and the defendant gets 9 players on the field. It is not fair because everything tends to favor the plaintiff in these procedural rule and these evidentiary rules. Now, this bill is an attempt to level that playing field, to give equity to both people. These are all Georgia citizens. Most of them are not even businesses involved in a lawsuit. If Bill and Jane get in an automobile accident, they're not businesses. They're just people, but they're living by these rules. And they're having to play within our civil justice system that's given them a hard time getting fairness. So back to the insurance rates. Why did this bill come out of Insurance Committee? Because it so directly impacts our insurance rates. So we're having these extremely high automobile insurance rates. But our insurance companies will tell you that they are paying out in claims anywhere between $108 and $120 for every $100 in premiums they're receiving. They are losing money on the claims process because the judgments and the verdicts and the settlements are so high. We've got doctors that are choosing to go to other states to open their medical practices instead of coming to Georgia, where they have some of the highest medical malpractice insurance rates in the country. That's a cost of doing business for the medical community, and we're thinking that that is greatly accentuating the lack of these doctors in rural Georgia. Why come to this state and go to a rural area where your malpractice insurance is so high that your profit is much lower than you could be going to another state? Some of these premises liability issues that you're going to hear more about from the senator from the 18th are making businesses decide, am I going to be the next CVS pharmacy that's going to be held responsible for a criminal act on my property after midnight in a parking lot? Or am I going to have to be the police force for the entire neighborhood if I learn that there's crime in the area? Are you going to close that store down? Are you going to decide to go to a different, maybe go to a more affluent neighborhood, go to Buckhead and open your store instead of Moorhead Avenue? We need to think through these implications, or you're going to have some food deserts and retail deserts where businesses don't want to go because they can't afford this liability. And it's getting to where they can't even buy insurance for it. We heard through this study committee numerous businesses that say our premiums have doubled for our liability coverage, tripled, quadrupled. It is breaking us. We heard from trucking companies that are mostly, by the way, small businesses in the state of Georgia. About 90% of our trucking companies are small, family-owned, and they are going out of business left and right because they simply cannot afford the liability insurance to run their trucks. So what's that going to do to all of us? Our availability of getting goods and services, the cost of the products that we buy. It's just like Ronald Reagan said way back in 1980. There was a tax increase suggested or proposed, and in his debates in that presidential race, he said, look, the American people are no fools. They realize that any increase in taxes or cost, in this case, they simply get passed on to the consumers in higher prices. We can stop this, and we can be fair to both sides by just leveling the playing field to some degree. I wanted to speak, I broke this bill out. There are really 15 different sections. And these are all tweaks or changes to rules of civil procedure, rules of evidence that level the playing field. I'm going to address 9 of them. The senator from the 18th is going to address the other 6. Some of them are technical. I'm losing some audience already, sitting there saying, oh God, here we go. We got to hear the details on 9. And I'm going to hit them as generically as I can, but I'm willing to take questions as long as you want to on these. The first one was that statute of limitations, the tolling of the statute of limitations. The senator from the 3rd asked the question about it. That is simply the length of time after your injury that you have to file a suit. And it's 2 years on a personal injury case in Georgia from the date of your accident. Most misdemeanor crimes are resolved, the prosecutions, within that 2-year period. Senator from the 22nd was a solicitor, and Augustine understands that. The public's going to get on the rear end of a prosecutor that isn't pushing the cases to a conclusion within 2 years. Misdemeanors are minor offenses. This was not the law, this tolling of the statute of limitations, till about a decade ago. We passed a law, the Crime Victims Bill of Rights, and it had a provision and said if you're the victim of a crime, the length of time, this time period, the 2-year statute of limitations, would be tolled or delayed until the criminal case was over. And it was aimed at people like if you got raped in an apartment complex and they didn't know who the perpetrator was and there was an investigation going on and you needed to find out, was that person a maintenance man at the apartment complex or a total stranger? Serious violent crimes to give them the ability to recover and know who might be responsible. The law got interpreted to apply to any crime, which includes misdemeanors like traveling too fast for conditions or failing to stop at a stop sign or following too closely and rear-ending somebody. These are not complicated matters to prove. And to the senator from the 3rd, if you were to plead the 5th Amendment and refuse to answer the question in your civil case, the law is crystal clear. There then becomes a presumption against you that you were guilty. So if you're in a DUI case and the other lawyer says, well, weren't you drunk at the time? And you say, oh, I plead the 5th Amendment, that might tend to incriminate me. They use that against you in the civil case. So this does not impede the prosecution of that case. This bill in Part 1, Section 1.1 only applies to felonies or serious offenses. There are different burdens of proof in civil cases and criminal cases anyway. The only way this helps you in a civil case is if the accused person pleads guilty and admits to their wrongdoing, accepts liability in their case. There are many other remedies as far as getting attorney fees for somebody being stubbornly litigious and refusing to admit something that's an obvious fact. You can still prove that they committed the criminal act in your civil case just by a preponderance of the evidence, which is the majority of the evidence. Whereas in a criminal case, you would have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So this is not a complicated hurdle to get over. And all we're talking about is the time for filing your suit. So how's that tie back into your insurance rates? Well, insurance companies, when they are put on notice of a claim, you get in a wreck or something, what do? You call your insurance agent. You put them on notice, I had a wreck, we might have a claim, they open a file. They immediately set aside some reserves. They set aside enough money to pay the anticipated value of that claim. And they may adjust it as time goes on, as they learn new facts about the injuries, etc. If you don't give some certainty how long that claim is open, They're setting aside this potential loss money on their books and jacking up the cost for everybody till it gets resolved. You're also delaying a trial, and it's hard to find your witnesses 4 or 5 years down the road. It's easier within that 2-year period. Second thing I'll talk about is written jury instructions. I mean, some of these things to you guys ought to seem like, man, that's common sense. I can't believe we don't already do this. In Part 1, Section 1-2, written jury instructions. Right now, at the end of the trial, all the evidence is closed. The judge rattles off about 10 to 15 pages worth of legal principles the jury should take into account in their deliberations. And just like a lot of what I'm saying is going over a bunch of your heads right now, imagine being on the jury and them reading you all this legalese and you trying to remember when you get back there, what did they say? Judges have the discretion now, if they want to send out with the jury written copy of those legal principles that they charge them with, they can do it, but they're not required to. This bill simply requires them to give it to the jury in writing, so when they're back in there deliberating, they're not confused what the legal principles are. They can read it and say, hey, yeah, what did that judge say about negligence or whatever? And they can read it and see the definition. This is not going to rock the world, but it's one of multiple issues. Section 5, Section 5.1 in Part 5, seatbelt evidence. I bet you if there's anybody paying attention here, you would assume that a jury can learn whether or not the drivers of the vehicles had their seatbelts on. You can see how important that might be if a vehicle rolled and somebody was thrown from it and got killed or had a head injury or something where they could have prevented that by simply following our law and wearing your seatbelt. Or if they get thrown through the windshield and get disfiguring scars, very easy to avoid simply by being responsible for your own safety. Current law does not let a jury even know that fact. And I bet a lot of you are saying, well, why not? That is relevant in the case. This provision would allow the juries to hear that for any relevant purpose. Part 7A. This starts on line 464. This is what we refer to as phantom damages. They're imaginary damages. Currently, juries can be given evidence of medical expenses that were never even paid. And I've used the example before, if the sort of the sticker price on your hospital bill, every one of you that's gotten a medical bill, you see the retail price, we'll call it, or sticker price, and then you see how much was actually paid for it, what the reduction was for health insurance or whatever, what your copay, your deductible, and you pay a very tiny amount at the bottom. Juries only see the top dollar. They are never told how much the hospital accepted as payment in full. Usually they're accepting that payment from health insurance. Sometimes they're negotiating with uninsured people. But they have been paid in full, and plaintiffs are presenting the evidence to the jury as if they really paid it out of their pocket, so they're getting a windfall, money that they never lost. An easier example to think about this is, let's say you went to Joseph Banks and you bought a suit. Any of you men that ever shop at Joseph Banks, if you ever pay full price, you have been snookered, because it's usually a 3-for-1 sale or something going on. And if you go in there and it has the tag on it that said this suit cost $750, but you paid $250, that's what it cost you. And you take it to the dry cleaners and they somehow mess it up, rip your suit, stain it, tear it, or whatever, and you go and say, hey, Mr. Dry Cleaner, you cost me my new suit. What's the fair amount for you to recover? The amount you paid for it, the $250, that's what you lost, or the tag that said it was $750. That's the closest I can come to explaining to you how silly it is to let people recover for money they didn't even sustain the injury or the damage. This closes that loophole, and by the way, it does not violate the collateral source rule. Professor Milich wrote this provision for me when we studied this a few years ago. He is the guru on evidence law in the state of Georgia, has written the treatises on that. The collateral source rule prevents you from mentioning that the insurance company paid it for you. This provision does not violate that. It just says you only introduce the amount that the hospital took as payment in full. Does not mention who paid it, whether it was the plaintiff or their health insurance company or somebody else. Part 4, Section 4.1, moving on to lines 167, et cetera, deals with direct actions against insurance companies. We got this funky little rule in Georgia law that if you are a motor common carrier, now that's being broadly interpreted to any commercial vehicle, and your driver causes a wreck, then you can be held responsible. The driver can get sued, the employer can get sued, but in that unique circumstance, the insurance company itself can also be directly sued. Why? I don't know how that got in Georgia law, way before my time. But can you see how that would bias a jury against the defendant? If you know that defendant is not paying the money, it's an insurance company writing the check, you're a whole lot more willing to award large damages. And here we go again, driving up the cost of insurance, the amounts of the verdicts. This provision also in Section 4 there, 4.3, deals with the CDL licenses of drivers. One other claim against the trucking company is that they negligently supervise their drivers or were negligent in the employment process. All this says is if they have a valid CDL license, there is a presumption that they were a good driver, that they were a competent driver. It doesn't mean that you couldn't introduce evidence if you find out they had had several wrecks already before for that company. You could introduce that evidence, but on the face of it, if they're a properly licensed driver, it's not suspended, they're not restricted, then it's presumed that the business was allowing competent drivers to drive. It also, though, by the way, makes it a felony if a trucking company allows a driver to drive without a CDL license. So if you got a driver that's on a suspended license or doesn't have CDL, not only can you get your pantsuit off for negligently letting them drive, but you can get prosecuted. I feel like that's a good balance of that section. A couple of more I'll mention. In Part 2, Section 2.1. Now I'm back to line 102 if anybody is following along. This is to prevent the jury, potential jurors in the process of jury selection from learning that there's insurance available to pay the verdict in the case. Jurors are disqualified from being on a jury if it's their own insurance company that's insuring the person being sued. Because you got a personal interest. Hey, my company's getting sued if I work for them, if I'm insured by them, et cetera. So we already have this rule. They're not supposed to know that there's insurance involved. Well, lawyers are getting around that when they're questioning potential jurors by saying, well, were you insured by Georgia Farm Bureau or Progressive? You ever work for them? Do anybody in your family insured by them? Have you ever been? And it's just a blinking beacon saying this insurance is going to pay this judgment, so don't hesitate to award whatever money we ask you for, because Mr. Johnson here, whoever the defendant is not actually paying it. All this does, you still keep those people off the jury, but you have them fill out a written qualification form up front and identify who their insurance company is or if they work for an insurance company. And then if the case involves that company, you don't even question those people. They stay back in the jury assembly room and aren't questioned. You get to the same place without bias in the jury. Two more we'll talk about, and then I'll turn it over to the senator from the 18th. In Part 1, Section 1.3a, there's a provision called bifurcation. That is the division of issues within one trial for separate determination. And the two of importance are liability, who's at fault, and damages. What's the amount of money they ought to recover? In cases where somebody is very seriously injured, it is easy for the jury to be very sympathetic to them and want them to recover money. And this allows the jury, same jury, to first decide who's at fault and don't hear all this evidence that creates their sympathy and bias for the person until they first decided who's at fault. Going back to that CVS case, in that case, the jury heard that somebody was grievously injured and they felt sorry for him, and they also heard that the the shooter, the bad guy who's probably in jail by that time, is not able to pay the money. You can see this happen in medical malpractice cases. First determine, was the doctor negligent or careless before you go decide the issue of how much damages to award. It keeps you from being biased. Now, this provision does not force a judge to do that. All it does is say if somebody requests that division of issues in the same trial, that it lists the factors that the judge should take into consideration in making his ruling, whether or not to allow it to be divided into two sections of the trial or not. Final thing that I'll speak to is in Part 1, Section 1.4, and that deals again with what information you give the jury. In these examples that you've heard of premises liability, which is what's really freaked out a lot of the business community because their rates are going through the roof. Some of them, the insurance companies saying, we can't touch Georgia market right now because we can't calculate what the reasonable risk is. We're seeing these verdicts over $100 million. How much are we going to charge these people for their premiums to cover our risk? Current law allows the jury to be told how this rule works, that whichever party you assess a percentage of fault to or portion fault to will be responsible for that portion of the verdict. So if you've got some poor person that's been hurt in a parking lot of a business and you're suing the business for not giving adequate security and the criminal who caused their action, and they tell you, if you award 95% fault against the bad actor, that's who the judgment will be collected from. Well, that dude's probably in prison. And you realize they're never going to collect that money. But if you find against the business this deep pocket, hey, Kroger's have got stores all over the world, give them 95%, they'll be paying it. Well, what's the jury going to do? It's to let the jury make their decision independent of that knowledge. They still apportion the fault, but they just reduce the verdict by that amount. We do that in other areas of the law, and it's the fairest way to keep the jury from being biased. So did anything that I just told y'all really rock the world or seem unfair or like they're ganging up on the plaintiffs? If it is, ask me a question about it, and we'll answer you, Mr. Rules Chairman. But in combination, these factors level the playing field and let juries get more rational results based on the evidence, which will have fairer, more reasonable insurance rates and cost of doing business in the state of Georgia, automobile insurance rates for our citizens, and it will keep us the #1 state to do business. Mr. President, I'm happy to yield the well for questions if there are any.
Senator, your time has expired, your 30-minute allotment in the well, and you have no questions.
Thank you.
All right, I want to give a quick update on our posture. We're going to take a lunch break, and when we come back, we will finish debate. So we're going to stand in recess until 2:45, but I want the Rules Chairman to make an announcement because in the interim, we're going to have a Rules meeting, and we have lunches over here in the ante room where if you're in the Rules Committee, you can bring those lunches up with you. It's going to be a working lunch, but I'll let the Chairman of the Rules Committee make those final arrangements.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to tell everybody, as the President said, if you're on the Rules Committee or you have a bill before Rules to consider, please get your lunch, enjoy your lunch, and then come up there with your lunch if you choose, or you can be here, and we'll start about 20 minutes on the Rules calendar or talking to people. Thank you, Mr. President. It's important everybody come by.
Senate will stand in recess until 2:45.